Welcome, we're so happy you tuned in tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The oscilloscope's amber screen flickered in the dim garage light, casting ghostly shadows across Noah Cross's angular face. At 17, he possessed the kind of restless intelligence that made teachers uncomfortable and classmates distant. While other kids his age were planning prom or worrying about college applications, Noah spent his nights elbow-deep in salvaged electronics, surrounded by the metallic bones of decommissioned military equipment he'd rescued from scrapyards across New Mexico. His mother's Honda pulled into the driveway with its familiar wheeze, signalling the end of another 12-hour shift at Presbyterian Hospital. Sarah Cross emerged looking exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled and her auburn hair escaping its ponytail. She paused at the garage entrance, watching her son's silhouette hunched over his latest project. "You're going to electrocute yourself one of these days," she said, though her voice carried more resignation than real concern. She'd given up trying to drag him away from his experiments years ago. "I'm being careful, Mum." Noah didn't look up from the oscilloscope's guts, where he was methodically replacing burnt capacitors with modern equivalents. "This baby's from 1962, military grade. They don't make them like this anymore." Sarah shook her head and disappeared into the house. Noah had always been different, reading quantum mechanics textbooks at 12, building radio receivers from spare parts at 14. The other military brats at school called him weird, but Noah preferred the company of electrons and magnetic fields to teenage drama anyway. The oscilloscope had been his best find yet, pulled from a pile of junk at Sanchez Salvage outside Santa Fe. The old man behind the counter had barely glanced at it when Noah offered $20, muttering something about old DARPA crap under his breath. What Sanchez didn't know, what Noah didn't know either, was that this particular piece of equipment had once been part of something called Project Kronos, a classified quantum resonance experiment that had been hastily shuttered in 1963 after producing results that terrified even its creators. For 3 weeks, Noah had been rebuilding the machine's internal architecture, integrating it with his custom-built Tesla coil and a high-frequency generator he'd assembled from marine radio parts. The fusion of 1960s military precision with modern amateur engineering created something that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, pregnant with the kind of electrical violence that New Mexico summers delivered with biblical fury. Noah glanced at his phone. 11:47 p.m. Perfect timing. He needed the atmospheric disturbance to test his theory about electromagnetic resonance patterns. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first crack of thunder split the night. Lightning strobed through the garage windows, and Noah felt the familiar electric tingle that preceded a major storm. He flipped the power switch on his jury-rigged apparatus, watching voltage readings climb on the digital multimeter he'd wired into the system. The oscilloscope screen came alive with dancing waveforms, complex interference patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Noah fine-tuned the frequency generator, chasing a harmonic sweet spot he'd calculated but never achieved. The Tesla coil hummed with increasing intensity, its copper windings glowing faintly in the darkness. Then he heard it, a voice emerging from the static of his old radio, words bleeding through from some distant transmission. "Eagle Squadron reporting heavy resistance over Hamburg. Repeat, heavy resistance." The voice carried the crisp, urgent tone of a military radio operator, but the accent was wrong, the phrasing too formal for modern communications. Noah frowned, adjusting the radio's frequency dial. The voice strengthened. "Coordinates confirmed. Proceed to target Alpha 7. Static swallowed the transmission, then spit out fragments. "God help us all." Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder arriving almost instantaneously. In that same moment, Noah's equipment reached critical resonance. The oscilloscope screen exploded with impossible geometries, waveforms that seemed to fold in on themselves like origami made of pure energy. The Tesla coil's hum became a scream, and the air itself began to taste metallic. What happened next defied every law of physics that Noah understood. The space around the oscilloscope began to warp, reality bending like heated glass. A darkness opened in the centre of the distortion, not the mere absence of light, but something that hurt to look at directly, a tiny wound in the fabric of space-time itself. Noah reached for the power switch, but the magnetic field had become so intense that his tools were flying toward the anomaly like iron filings toward a magnet. The radio's static crescendoed into a banshee wail, and that impossible voice from the past shouted clearly through the chaos. "Trinity test confirmed! The gadget works! God forgive us!" The garage tilted, or maybe Noah tilted. The world became a kaleidoscope of spinning tools and sparking electronics, and then the darkness swallowed everything with the sound of reality tearing like wet fabric. Consciousness returned in pieces, the taste of copper pennies, the smell of sage and dust, the sensation of grit against his cheek. Noah opened his eyes to find himself face down in a red desert sand, his body aching as if he'd been thrown from a moving car. The familiar weight of his smartphone pressed against his thigh, and his garage-stained t-shirt and jeans felt alien against the profound silence of the wilderness. He pushed himself upright, squinting against sunlight that seemed wrong somehow, too yellow, too clean. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional scrub brush. There was no sign of his garage, his house, or even the storm that had been raging moments before. Panic clawed at his chest as he checked his phone. No signal. The date read July 15th, but the year displayed as 1943. Noah stared at the screen, certain it was malfunctioning, until he noticed something else. The device's GPS showed his location as approximately 30 miles northwest of a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico. The name triggered something in his memory, a fragment from the history books he'd devoured during his obsession with Cold War technology. Los Alamos, 1943, the Manhattan Project, the secret city where America built the atomic bomb. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a military jeep, its olive-drab paint job and angular design distinctly different from modern vehicles. Noah stood frozen as the vehicle approached, his mind racing through possible explanations that didn't involve time travel. Because time travel was impossible, wasn't it? The jeep screeched to a halt 50 yards away, and two soldiers emerged with their rifles raised. Their uniforms were museum pieces, wool garrison caps, canvas gaiters, and the kind of equipment pouches that belonged in old war movies. But the weapons they carried were real enough, and the suspicion in their eyes was contemporary to any era. "Halt! Identify yourself." The taller soldier's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his authoritative tone. Noah raised his hands, his engineer's mind cataloguing details even through his terror. The soldiers' uniforms bore insignia he recognised from historical documentaries, the distinctive patch of the Manhattan Engineer District. The younger soldier couldn't have been more than 19, his face sunburned and serious beneath his cap. I'm Noah Cross," he managed, his voice hoarse from breathing desert dust. "I think I'm lost." The soldiers exchanged glances. The older one, a sergeant by his stripes, stepped closer while keeping his rifle trained on Noah's chest. "Lost?" He looked pointedly at Noah's modern clothing, the synthetic fabric and machine-stitched seams that wouldn't be invented for decades. "Son, you're about as lost as a person can get. This is a restricted military zone." They searched him with professional efficiency, confiscating his phone. What the hell is this thing? His wallet, and the small multi-tool he always carried. Noah's driver's license sparked particular interest. The laminated plastic, the holographic security features, and the issuing date of 2024 caused confused murmurs between the soldiers. The ride to the military checkpoint passed in surreal silence. Noah squeezed between two armed guards in the back of the jeep. The landscape looked familiar, yet alien. The same red rocks and endless sky he'd known all his life, but somehow cleaner, emptier, as if the world were holding its breath. The checkpoint itself was a collection of temporary buildings surrounded by barbed wire and serious-looking sentries. Noah was processed with military efficiency, fingerprinted, photographed, and subjected to an interrogation that began politely, but grew increasingly intense as his story proved impossible to verify. "Let me get this straight," said Lieutenant Morrison, the intelligence officer who'd taken over the questioning. He was young for his rank, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested too many hours spent indoors with classified documents. "You claim to be from Albuquerque. but we can't verify your address. Your identification card is made from materials we've never seen, issued by a department that doesn't exist, and you were found wandering in a restricted area with no memory of how you got there." Noah stuck to the story he'd hastily constructed. Amnesia from a car accident, possible head trauma, confusion about dates and locations. It was thin, but anything approaching the truth would have them convinced he was either insane or an enemy agent. "The thing is," Morrison continued, leaning back in his metal chair, "we've been having some unusual reports lately. Strange lights in the sky, electromagnetic disturbances. Some of the eggheads think the Germans might be testing some new kind of weapon, makes us jumpy about unexplained visitors." Before Noah could respond, the interrogation room door opened, and a man in civilian clothes entered. He was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of intense, analytical gaze that Noah recognised in fellow science enthusiasts. The man glanced at Noah's file, then studied Noah himself with unconcealed curiosity. "Dr. Walter Irwin," the man introduced himself, extending a hand that Noah shook automatically. "I'm one of the physicists working on the project here. Lieutenant Morrison thought I might want to speak with you." Dr. Irwin settled into a chair across from Noah, his manner more collegial than interrogative. "I've been reading your statements. You mentioned being interested in electronics, electromagnetic theory. Tell me, what do you know about quantum mechanics?" The question was clearly a test, but Noah couldn't help himself. Despite the impossible circumstances, the prospect of discussing physics with a real scientist was irresistible. "Well, I've read about wave-particle duality, quantum superposition, the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Einstein's objections to quantum entanglement." Dr. Irwin's eyebrows rose with each reference. In 1943, quantum mechanics was still cutting-edge science, discussed mainly in academic circles and classified research programs. For a teenager, especially one found wandering in the desert, to speak so knowledgeably about such advanced concepts was unprecedented. "Fascinating," Dr. Irwin murmured. "And what's your opinion on the practical applications of quantum theory? Theoretical, of course." Noah felt like a student stumbling through an exam he hadn't studied for, except the subject matter was the fundamental nature of reality itself. I think we're only beginning to understand the implications. Quantum tunneling, for instance, or the possibility that observation affects reality at the subatomic level. It could revolutionize everything from computing to energy production." The room fell silent. Dr. Irwin and Lieutenant Morrison exchanged a look that Noah couldn't interpret, but he sensed he'd said something significant, possibly dangerously so. "Mr. Cross," Dr. Irwin said finally, "I'm going to make a recommendation that might sound unusual. We have a shortage of qualified personnel here, particularly bright young minds who understand advanced physics. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a position as a junior research assistant. It would solve your immediate problem of having nowhere to go, and it would allow us to keep an eye on you while we verify your background." Noah's heart hammered against his ribs. A position at Los Alamos in 1943 meant working on the Manhattan Project, helping to build the weapons that would end World War II and usher in the atomic age. The moral implications were staggering, but what choice did he have? Refusing would only deepen their suspicions, and he needed time to figure out how to return to his own era. "I'd be honoured to help however I can," he said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The temporary quarters they assigned him were Spartan but comfortable. A narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the sprawling complex of laboratories and living spaces that made up the secret city. Noah lay awake that first night, staring at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than the ones he remembered, wondering if he was going insane, or if he'd somehow stumbled into the greatest scientific adventure in human history. His first day of work began before dawn with a security briefing that emphasized the absolute necessity of discretion. The project was compartmentalized, with each worker knowing only what they needed to complete their specific tasks. Noah was assigned to the electronics division, where his job involved calibrating sensitive measuring instruments and maintaining the complex array of equipment needed for the scientists' experiments. The work was fascinating despite his limited access to information. He found himself surrounded by technology that was advanced for 1943, but primitive by the standards of his own time. Vacuum tube computers the size of refrigerators, mechanical calculators that clicked and whirred through complex equations, and electromagnetic devices that seemed to bend the laws of physics through brute force rather than elegant engineering. It was during his second week that he first encountered Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer himself. The scientific director of the project was younger than Noah had expected from photographs, but he possessed an intensity that made the air around him seem to vibrate with barely contained energy. Oppenheimer moved through the laboratories like a force of nature, discussing quantum theory in one breath and Sanskrit poetry in the next. "You're the young man Walter's been telling me about," Oppenheimer said when Dr. Irwin introduced them. His pale blue eyes seemed to look straight through Noah, as if he could read the secrets written on his soul, the one with the interesting perspectives on electromagnetic theory. Noah mumbled something appropriately modest while trying not to stare at the man who would become known as the father of the atomic bomb. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it left him shaken. This wasn't history anymore. These were real people making real decisions that would reshape the world. The moral weight of his situation hit him fully during a conversation with Eva Stein, a young woman who worked as a laboratory assistant in the chemistry division. She was perhaps 22, with dark hair pinned back severely and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Eva had fled Nazi Germany in 1938, leaving behind family members who had since disappeared into the horror of the Holocaust. "They have my parents," she told Noah one evening as they shared coffee in the mess hall. "My younger brother too. The letters stopped coming last year." Her voice was steady, but Noah could see the carefully controlled grief in the set of her shoulders. "Every day I work here, I tell myself that what we're building will end this war faster, maybe save people like them." Noah wanted to tell her the truth, that her family was likely already dead, that the bombs they were building would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, that the war would end in August, but the nuclear age would bring its own terrors. Instead, he listened and nodded, and felt the weight of forbidden knowledge settle on his chest like a stone. Eva was too observant for her own good. Within a few weeks, she began asking pointed questions about Noah's background, his education, his mysterious appearance in the desert. She noticed inconsistencies in his story, anachronisms in his speech, and the way he sometimes seemed to know things he shouldn't. "You're not who you say you are," she confronted him one evening as they walked between the laboratory buildings. The New Mexico sky blazed with stars unmarked by light pollution, and the air carried the scent of sage and the faint ozone smell of high-voltage experiments. "Your accent isn't quite right for New Mexico. Your clothes, when they brought you in, the fabric was like nothing I've seen. And yesterday, when Dr. Fermi was discussing neutron bombardment, you started to say something about enrichment cascades before you caught yourself." Noah's blood turned to ice water. Uranium enrichment cascades were a theoretical concept in 1943, not yet implemented in the massive facilities at Oak Ridge. His knowledge of the process came from textbooks written decades in the future. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but Eva stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "I think you do. The question is whether you're a German spy with access to intelligence we don't know about, or something else entirely." She paused, then added quietly, "There's something about you that doesn't fit in this time." The phrase hit Noah like a physical blow. He stopped walking, staring at her in the starlight. "This time?" Eva's expression softened slightly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about people who slipped between moments, who fell through cracks in the world. I always thought they were just stories." She reached out and touched his arm gently. "But then I met you. Standing there in the desert night, surrounded by the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century, working to unlock the secrets of the atom, Noah made a decision that would change everything." He told Eva the truth. Not all of it at first. Just fragments, pieces of an impossible story about oscilloscopes and time rifts, and accidentally discovering that the boundaries between past and future were more fragile than anyone imagined. Eva listened without interruption, her scientist mind analysing and cataloguing, even as her human heart struggled to accept what she was hearing. "Show me," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, show me proof." Noah led her to his quarters and retrieved the items the security personnel had returned to him: his wallet, his phone, his multi-tool. Under the light of a table lamp, Eva examined each object with forensic attention. The synthetic materials, the manufacturing precision, the electronic components that wouldn't be invented for decades. All of it pointed to a technology base far beyond 1943. When Noah powered on his phone and showed her the stored photographs from his own time, images of modern Albuquerque, of the Los Alamos National Laboratory as it would exist in the 21st century, Eva's scientific skepticism finally crumbled. "Mein Gott," she whispered, scrolling through pictures of a world she would never live to see. "It's real. You're really from... When did you say... Ixas Onesibse?" "I didn't plan this," Noah said urgently. "I was just experimenting with electromagnetic resonance, and something went wrong. I need to get back, but I need equipment I can't access, and knowledge I'm not supposed to have." Eva was quiet for a long time, studying his face in the lamplight. Finally she asked, "In your time, do we win the war?" "Yes, but the cost." Noah struggled with how much to reveal. "The bombs we're building here, they work. They end the war in August 1945, but they also kill hundreds of thousands of people in Japan, and they start an arms race that brings the world to the brink of destruction multiple times. And if we don't build them, I don't know, maybe Germany develops them first. Maybe the war drags on for years longer, and millions more die in conventional fighting. History is complicated." Eva nodded slowly. "Then we continue the work. But we also get you home." She looked at him with new determination. "What do you need?" The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. Noah needed to recreate the conditions that had brought him to 1943, the specific electromagnetic resonance frequency, the quantum interference pattern, and most critically, a massive energy source to power the dimensional rift. The problem was that two of those three requirements involved classified materials and equipment that were under constant guard. For 2 weeks they planned in whispered conversations and stolen moments between work shifts. Eva used her access to the chemistry labs to identify potential sources of the materials they needed, while Noah designed modifications to existing equipment that might generate the necessary quantum field resonance. Their planning was complicated by the growing suspicions of Frank Kessler, a junior physicist whose professional jealousy had been kindled by Noah's rapid integration into the project. Kessler had noticed the attention Dr. Irwin paid to Noah's insights, the way senior scientists sometimes paused to listen when Noah offered suggestions. More dangerously, he'd begun asking questions about Noah's background and qualifications. "There's something off about that kid," Kessler complained to anyone who would listen. "He shows up out of nowhere with no verifiable credentials, and suddenly he's offering advice to Oppenheimer himself. Mark my words, he's not what he seems." The situation came to a head on the evening of July 14th, just as Noah and Eva were preparing to attempt their escape. Kessler had spent weeks gathering what he considered evidence of Noah's suspicious nature, his mysterious arrival, his advanced knowledge, the inconsistencies in his personal history. That night, he presented his findings to Army intelligence. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Security personnel searched Noah's quarters, analysed his possessions, and subjected him to intense questioning that grew more hostile by the hour. The phone, with its impossible technology, was all the proof they needed that Noah was hiding something significant. "Son," said Colonel Patterson, the security chief who'd taken over the case, "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." He held up Noah's smartphone, its sleek design and advanced materials utterly alien in the 1940s environment. "This device contains technology that's decades ahead of anything we've developed. The only question is whether you're working for the Germans, the Russians, or someone else entirely." Noah tried to maintain his cover story, but it was collapsing under the weight of physical evidence and mounting suspicion. They knew he wasn't who he claimed to be. The only question was what they would do about it. The answer came at dawn on July 15th, when Colonel Patterson informed him that he was being transferred to a more secure facility for enhanced interrogation. The implication was clear. They would use whatever methods necessary to extract the truth from him, and given the stakes of the Manhattan Project, those methods would not be gentle. It was Eva who provided the solution. Using her security clearance and knowledge of the facility's layout, she created a diversion that would give them one chance to escape, but only if they acted during the Trinity test itself, when attention would be focused on the world's first atomic bomb detonation. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. The Trinity test was scheduled for 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, just hours away. The massive electrical systems used to trigger the bomb's detonation would create electromagnetic interference across the entire region, perfect cover for the kind of quantum resonance experiment they needed to perform. Eva had managed to smuggle key components from various laboratories, high-voltage capacitors, resonance coils, and most crucially, a small sample of enriched uranium that would provide the quantum instability necessary to punch through the dimensional barrier. They would use the high-voltage testing chamber in Lab 7, timing their experiment to coincide with the Trinity detonation. "If your theory is correct," Eva said as they made final preparations in the pre-dawn darkness, "the atomic blast will provide enough energy to reopen the temporal rift. But Noah," she paused, her hand on his arm, "if you're wrong, we'll both be vaporized along with everything else in this desert." Noah looked at her in the dim light, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to help him return to a future she would never see. "Come with me," he said impulsively. "I don't know if it's possible, but..." Eva shook her head. "This is my time. My war. I have work to finish here." She pressed something into his hands, a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. "But perhaps something of me can make the journey with you." They entered Lab 7 through a service tunnel that Eva had scouted weeks earlier, emerging into the high-voltage testing chamber where massive electrical equipment hummed with barely contained power. Noah worked with desperate efficiency, connecting his improvised quantum resonance device to the lab's electrical systems while Eva monitored for security patrols. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten. In a bunker 20 miles away, scientists and military personnel were making final preparations to witness humanity's first glimpse of atomic fire. Noah's hand shook as he made the final connections, knowing that in a few minutes the course of human history would change forever. At 5:29 a.m., alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Someone had discovered their absence, and security teams were sweeping the complex. Eva barricaded the laboratory door while Noah powered up his equipment, watching voltage readings climb toward the critical threshold. 30 seconds to Trinity, Eva reported, monitoring a radio she'd brought to track the countdown. "Noah, whatever happens, I want you to know..." Her words were cut off by the sound of soldiers shouting outside the laboratory. Security personnel had found them. 10 seconds, Noah whispered, his hand hovering over the activation switch. Through the laboratory's small window he could see the distant Jornada del Muerto desert where history was about to be made. The world went white. For an instant that lasted eternity, Noah experienced the birth of the atomic age as pure energy. The Trinity bomb's detonation 20 miles away registered as a pressure wave that seemed to compress time itself, while his quantum resonance device screamed to life in sympathetic response. Reality folded inward like origami made of light and impossible mathematics. He felt Eva's hand in his as the dimensional rift opened. Not the tiny wound in space-time that had brought him to 1943, but a vast tunnel of swirling energy that stretched between moments. The laboratory around them dissolved into constituent atoms, then reformed as something else entirely. The transition felt like drowning in reverse, a sensation of being pulled up through layers of compressed time until he burst through the surface of the present, gasping and disoriented. Noah found himself lying on the concrete floor of his garage, surrounded by the familiar clutter of his electronics workshop. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, but wrong in subtle ways that made his skin crawl. The oscilloscope that had started his journey sat on the workbench, but now it bore the faint inscription JRO 1943 etched into its metal housing. His radio, previously tuned to a local rock station, was picking up what sounded like a big band number from the 1940s. Noah staggered to his feet, his mind reeling from the transition. Outside, dawn was breaking over familiar mountains, but the light seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if the world had been subtly retuned while he was away. He stumbled into the house, finding his mother already gone for her morning shift at the hospital. It wasn't until he walked to school that the changes became apparent. The building was the same, but the name carved into the stone facade now read Eva Stein Memorial High School. Inside, a bronze plaque near the main office commemorated an anonymous contributor to the Manhattan Project, whose sacrifice advanced the cause of freedom. Noah stood before the plaque for a long time, reading and rereading the dedication that mentioned a young German refugee who had died in a laboratory accident during the final days of the war. The official story was sanitized, bureaucratic, but Noah could read between the lines. Eva had stayed behind, continuing her work on the project that would end the war and reshape the world. The final confirmation came when he arrived home that afternoon to find a package waiting on his doorstep. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was Eva's grandmother's locket, the same one she had pressed into his hands moments before their escape attempt. A note written in Eva's careful handwriting accompanied it. "My dear Noah, if you're reading this, then you made it back safely, and time has found a way to complete our circle. I wanted you to know that I survived the laboratory accident that the official reports describe, though I was never able to explain the miraculous escape that saved my life. I went on to work on peaceful applications of atomic energy, always remembering the young man from the future who showed me that science must be tempered with wisdom. The locket has waited 60 years to find you again. Perhaps now you understand that some journeys through time are meant to bring us home to who we were always supposed to become." E.S. 1983. Noah clutched the locket, feeling the weight of decades and the warmth of a friendship that had transcended time itself. He had returned to his own era, but the experience had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The burden of knowledge he carried, about the future consequences of the atomic age, about the moral complexities of scientific progress, would shape every decision he made going forward. That evening, he stood in his garage workshop, staring at the oscilloscope that had started his incredible journey. The machine hummed quietly, its screens dark and peaceful. Noah reached for the power switch, then stopped. The temptation to experiment further, to explore other moments in history, was almost overwhelming. Instead, he walked outside into the New Mexico night. Rain was falling, gentle and warm, and in the distance lightning played across the mountains where Los Alamos National Laboratory continued its work into the 21st century. Noah tilted his face to the sky, feeling the electric potential in the air, and made his choice. Some doors, once opened, should remain closed. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, no matter how alluring the mysteries it might reveal. He had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of time itself, had walked among the giants who shaped the modern world, and had learned that the past was both more fragile and more resilient than he had ever imagined. The locket around his neck caught the light from a distant street lamp, a silver reminder that some connections transcend the boundaries of space and time. Eva Stein had chosen to stay in her moment of history, to face the consequences of the atomic age with courage and wisdom. Now it was Noah's turn to find his place in the world, armed with the knowledge that the future was not fixed, that individual choices mattered, and that the responsibility to use knowledge wisely was the greatest burden and privilege that any scientist could bear. As he stood there in the rain, watching lightning dance across the sky, Noah Cross understood that his real journey was just beginning. The boy who had accidentally torn a hole in time had returned as a young man who understood the weight of temporal responsibility. Whatever came next, he would face it with the wisdom Eva had given him, and the understanding that some adventures were meant to change not the world, but the adventurer himself. The oscilloscope in his garage would remain forever silent, its quantum secrets locked away. But the echo of his journey through time would ripple forward through every choice he made, every life he touched, and every moment when he chose wisdom over knowledge and responsibility over power. In the end, that was the most profound discovery of all, that the greatest experiments were not with the fabric of space-time, but with the limitless potential of the human spirit to grow, to learn, and to become something greater than what it was before. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The morning Dr. Elena Marrow disappeared from her own timeline began like any other. She arrived at the Meridian Physics Institute at 7:30, her usual time, carrying a thermos of coffee and a mind buzzing with calculations. The temporal scanner prototype hummed quietly in Laboratory 7, its chrome surface reflecting the early sunlight streaming through reinforced windows. Eleanor had spent 3 years perfecting the device, not for time travel, she reminded herself, but for temporal observation, a window into the past, nothing more. She never intended to step through that window. The scanner resembled a sleek metallic archway, its frame embedded with quantum processors and temporal field generators. Dr. Marcus Webb, her mentor and the project's director, had insisted on this morning's test despite Helena's reservations about the unstable quantum matrices. The device was meant to project images from the past onto a viewing screen, allowing historians to witness events firsthand without the contamination of physical presence. Revolutionary, but safe. Eleanor ran her final diagnostics, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. Energy readings fluctuated wildly. The temporal field was unstable, chaotic even. She reached for her communication device to postpone the test when the scanner activated itself. The world exploded into light. When Elena's vision cleared, she stood in the same laboratory, but everything had changed. Dust covered every surface inches thick. The walls bore massive cracks that spiderwebbed across the ceiling. Vines had somehow grown through the reinforced concrete, their leaves an unnatural silver colour that seemed to shift between seasons, budding, flowering, dying, and budding again in an endless cycle. She stumbled outside and gasped. The city of New Geneva stretched before her, but it was wrong. Victorian brownstones sat beside towering glass spires that hadn't existed in her time. Medieval castles occupied spaces where shopping centres should have been. A section of downtown flickered like a broken hologram, alternating between a bustling Roman marketplace and the skeletal remains of some futuristic metropolis. In the distance, she could see what appeared to be Egyptian pyramids, their surfaces gleaming with technology that definitely wasn't ancient. The sky itself was fractured. Day and night existed simultaneously in different quadrants, separated by jagged lines of aurora that pulsed with temporal energy. In one section, 3 moons hung in a starless void. In another, twin suns blazed over a landscape of impossible geometry. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto what had once been a sidewalk, but now appeared to be cobblestones that occasionally morphed into metallic grating. This wasn't the future she had expected. This wasn't any future that should have been possible. "First time seeing the collapse?" a voice asked behind her. Eleanor spun around to find a woman approaching, but something was immediately wrong with her appearance. She wore a Victorian dress of deep burgundy, complete with bustle and high collar, but her left arm was entirely mechanical, a sleek prosthetic that hummed with advanced servos. Her face was young, perhaps 25, but her eyes held the weariness of centuries. "I'm Victoria Chen," the woman said, extending her organic hand. "Or I was, in 1887. Now I'm not sure what I am." "Eleanor Marrow," she replied shakily, accepting the handshake. "What happened here? What is this place?" Victoria's laugh held no humour. "This is what's left of reality. Welcome to the aftermath of humanity's greatest mistake, time travel." Elena's blood turned cold. "That's impossible. We never invented time travel. The scanner was just for observation." "Your scanner," Victoria interrupted, "was the prototype that started this nightmare. Come with me. There are others you need to meet, and not much time before the next flux wave hits." Victoria led Elena through streets that defied comprehension. Buildings aged decades in seconds, then reversed the process. A fountain in the town square flowed upward, its water crystallizing into ice before exploding back into droplets. People moved through this chaos with practiced resignation, some in medieval armour, others in clothing Elena didn't recognise. A few in spacesuits that seemed to be keeping them alive in pockets of temporal void. They entered what had once been the city library, its classical columns now supporting a roof that appeared to be made of pure energy. Inside, dozens of people from different eras had created a makeshift community. A knight in chainmail shared a meal with a woman whose skin had a metallic sheen and circuits visible beneath the surface. Children from various centuries played together, their laughter creating small bubbles of temporal stability around them. These are the chrono-refugees, Victoria explained. People torn from their proper timelines when the collapse began. Some of us remember our original lives. Others don't remember anything before the chaos. An elderly man approached them, his beard white as snow but his eyes sharp with intelligence. He wore robes that seemed to shift between the simple cloth of a monk and the complex materials of some advanced civilization. "This is Brother Benedict," Victoria said. "He's our historian, though his timeline of origin is complicated." Benedict studied Elena with interest. "You're from the origin point, aren't you? The 21st century?" Elena nodded, still struggling to process what she was seeing. "Then you must understand," Benedict continued, "that time is not a river, as your scientist believed. It's more like a web, with each strand connected to every other strand. When your people created that first temporal device, you didn't just observe the past, you connected to it, and every connection created a paradox." He gestured to the walls around them, which were covered in what Elena initially mistook for artwork, but now realized were charts, diagrams and equations written in dozens of different languages and scientific notations from across history. "We call it the Chrono Codex," Benedict explained. "Everything we've learned about the collapse, compiled by refugees from across time. The first paradox was small, a single photon displaced from its proper temporal position. But paradoxes multiply exponentially. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, and so on." Elena studied the equations, her trained mind beginning to grasp the horrific implications. "But that means—" "Yes," Victoria said grimly. "Every attempt to observe the past created new contradictions. Every new contradiction destabilized more of the timeline. Within a century of your first experiment, causality itself began to break down." Benedict led them deeper into the library, past groups of refugees trying to maintain some semblance of normal life in the chaos. They reached a vault-like room where the walls were covered in what appeared to be screens, but Elena realized they were actually windows into different time periods. "This is where we keep the worst of it," Benedict said. "The temporal wounds that never heal." Eleanor approached one of the windows and nearly screamed. Through it, she could see a battle that never ended. The same soldiers dying and being reborn every few seconds, trapped in an infinite loop of violence. Another window showed a city where time moved backward, children aging into elderly people before becoming young again, in an endless cycle of reversed causality. "The paradox zones," Victoria explained, "places where time became so tangled that it lost all meaning. Some refugees come from there. They're different. Their memories exist in multiple states simultaneously. They remember being born and dying at the same time." Eleanor's scientific mind reeled. This wasn't just temporal displacement. This was the complete breakdown of linear causality. She thought of her mentor, Dr. Webb, his excitement about the scanner's potential, his dismissal of her concerns about quantum stability. "My mentor," she whispered, "Marcus Webb. He pushed for the experiments even when I warned him about the instabilities." Benedict and Victoria exchanged a dark look. "Dr. Webb," Benedict said slowly, "is mentioned frequently in our records. According to the historical fragments we've recovered, he became obsessed with temporal manipulation after the first successful observation. He built dozens of devices, each more powerful than the last." Victoria nodded. The refugees from later periods tell stories about him. By the end, he was trying to use time travel to make himself immortal. jumping between timelines to avoid death. Each jump made the collapse worse. Elena felt sick. Her mentor, the man who'd guided her career, had apparently become the architect of reality's destruction, and she had helped him build the first device. A low rumble shook the building, and everyone in the library immediately began moving with practiced urgency. "Flux wave," Victoria called out. "Everyone to the stability zones." Eleanor watched in amazement as the refugees sorted themselves into groups and hurried to different sections of the building. Some areas were marked with symbols she didn't recognize, others with equations that looked almost like her own work. "The building exists in multiple time states," Benedict explained as they hurried to a corner marked with a complex mathematical formula Eleanor recognized as a temporal stabilization equation. Different sections are anchored to different periods. During flux waves, we have to match our temporal signature to the most stable zone available. They huddled together as the wave passed through. Eleanor felt it like a physical force, a sensation of falling sideways through time itself. Images flashed before her eyes. The laboratory as it had been in her time, then as it might have been in different timelines, then as it was now in ruins. For a moment, she saw herself as an old woman, as a child, as someone she'd never been and would never be. When the wave passed, several refugees had simply vanished. "Where did they go?" Elena asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Dispersed," Victoria said sadly. "Sometimes the waves tear people from their temporal anchors completely. They don't die. They just cease to have ever existed." Eleanor's hands were shaking now. The magnitude of what her work had unleashed was beyond comprehension. Entire civilizations lost to paradox. Billions of people scattered across impossible timelines or erased from existence entirely. "There has to be a way to fix this," she said desperately. "Some way to reverse the damage." Benedict looked at her with something like pity. "We've been trying for subjective centuries. Some of us have been here so long we've forgotten what linear time feels like. The collapse is self-perpetuating now. Every moment that passes creates new paradoxes. But there might be one way," Victoria added quietly. "It's never been attempted because it would require someone from the origin point, someone who understands the original technology." Eleanor's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Victoria and Benedict led her to another section of the library, this one filled with devices that looked like they'd been cobbled together from technology spanning millennia. Steam-powered computers sat beside quantum processors, and everything was connected by cables that seemed to phase in and out of visibility. "We call it the anchor engine," Benedict explained. "Theoretically, it could stabilize someone's temporal signature long enough for them to travel back to the origin point and prevent the first experiment." Elena studied the bizarre machine. She could see elements of her own temporal scanner design incorporated into its structure, along with technologies she couldn't even begin to understand. "The problem," Victoria continued, "is that using it is almost certainly fatal. The temporal stresses involved in travelling backward through a collapsing timeline would tear apart anyone who wasn't perfectly synchronized with the original paradox. And even if it worked," Benedict added, "changing the origin point would erase this timeline entirely. Everyone you've met here, everything we've built, none of it would ever have existed." Eleanor stared at the machine, understanding the impossible choice before her. She could return to her own time and prevent the collapse, but doing so would erase all these people who had shown her kindness, who had built a community in the ruins of reality itself, people who existed only because of the disaster she had helped create. But the alternative was letting the collapse continue, watching reality tear itself apart until nothing remained but paradox and chaos. Before she could voice her decision, another sound filled the library. Not the low rumble of a flux wave, but something far worse. It was a roar that seemed to come from time itself, accompanied by a grinding noise like the universe's gears slipping. "Paradox, beast," Victoria whispered, her face pale with terror. Through the library's windows, Eleanor saw something that defied description approaching. It looked like a creature made of fractured time itself. Parts of it were ancient and decaying, other parts were newborn, and still other parts flickered between different states of existence. It had too many eyes, all of them showing different time periods, and when it moved, reality warped around it. "They're drawn to temporal anomalies," Benedict explained as they backed away from the windows. "The larger the paradox, the more dangerous they become. And you," he looked at Elena, "are the ultimate paradox. Someone from the origin point existing in the collapsed timeline." The creature smashed through the library's wall with casual ease. Its roar was the sound of history breaking, and Eleanor could feel it in her bones. Several refugees screamed as the beast's presence created micro-paradoxes around them, aging them decades in seconds or reverting them to children. "The anchor engine!" Victoria shouted over the chaos. "It's the only way!" Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran to the bizarre machine and began working to activate it, her fingers flying over controls that spanned centuries of technological development. Behind her, she could hear the paradox beast tearing through the library, its very presence unravelling the refugees' carefully maintained stability. The machine hummed to life, its temporal field generators creating a bubble of stable time around Elena. She could feel the device scanning her quantum signature, matching it to the original paradox that had brought her here. The process was agonizing. Every cell in her body felt like it was being torn apart and reassembled. "Elena!" Victoria called out. "The beast! It's coming this way!" Eleanor looked back to see the creature bearing down on her, its fractured form leaving trails of temporal distortion in the air. She had seconds before it reached her, seconds before its presence would destabilize the anchor engine completely. With no time left, she activated the return sequence. Reality exploded into fragments around her. She experienced every moment of her life simultaneously. Her childhood, her education, her work on the scanner, her journey to this collapsed future. But she also experienced moments that had never happened, alternate versions of her life where she'd made different choices, where the scanner had never been built, where she had never been born at all. Then, mercifully, everything went dark. Elena awakened in her apartment, morning sunlight streaming through familiar windows. For a moment she thought the entire experience had been a dream. Then she looked at her clock and realized she was back. 3 days before the first scanner test. She had 3 days to prevent the end of the world. Eleanor raced to the laboratory, her mind still reeling with memories of the collapsed future. Dr. Webb was already there, making final adjustments to the scanner. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. "Elena, perfect timing. I've made some modifications to the quantum matrix. We should be able to push the temporal range much further than originally planned." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Those modifications, she remembered Benedict mentioning them in the Chrono Codex. They were what transformed the scanner from a simple observation device into the paradox engine that would destroy causality itself. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I think we should postpone the test. I've been running simulations and there are some stability issues." "Nonsense," Webb interrupted, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "Elena, do you understand what we're on the verge of achieving? We won't just be able to observe history, we'll be able to interact with it. Change it, if necessary." Elena realized with growing horror that her mentor had always intended to build a time machine. The scanner had just been the first step, a way to test temporal manipulation without arousing suspicion from the oversight board. "Marcus, you can't," she pleaded. "The paradoxes alone would." "Would what?" Webb's expression hardened. "Elena, I'm disappointed. I thought you understood the magnitude of our work. The applications are limitless. We could prevent wars, cure diseases, even eliminate death itself by jumping between timelines." Elena stared at him, seeing not her mentor but the man who had become obsessed with immortality, who would build device after device until reality itself collapsed. The kind, brilliant professor who had guided her career was already gone, replaced by ambition and hubris. She spent the next 2 days trying to convince Webb to abandon the test, but he was immovable. Worse, he had the backing of both the university and several government agencies who saw the scanner's military potential. Elena's warnings about paradoxes and temporal instability were dismissed as pre-test jitters. On the morning of the test, Elena made her final play. She arrived at the laboratory early and began sabotaging the scanner's quantum processors. If she couldn't convince Webb to stop, she would make it impossible for the device to function. She was deep in the scanner's control systems when Webb arrived with the security team. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said sadly. "I know you've been working against the project. The security cameras recorded everything." Elena looked up at the guards, realizing she had failed. In a few hours the scanner would activate, the first paradox would form, and the slow collapse of reality would begin. But then she noticed something. The guards were keeping their distance from the scanner itself. The device's temporal field was already affecting local space-time, creating minor distortions that made people uncomfortable. Elena smiled grimly. Webb might have caught her sabotaging the processors, but he didn't know about the feedback loop she'd created in the field generators. The scanner would still activate, but instead of opening a stable viewing portal, it would overload catastrophically. The demonstration proceeded as planned. Government officials, university administrators, and senior faculty gathered in the observation booth, while Webb proudly explained the scanner's capabilities. Eleanor was escorted to a chair in the front row, treated as an honoured guest despite her attempts at sabotage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb announced, "you're about to witness the first glimpse into history itself. Behold, the past." He activated the scanner. For a moment it worked exactly as designed. The archway filled with swirling temporal energy, and images began to form, glimpses of the laboratory as it had existed years before, then decades, and centuries. Eleanor saw the land before the building was constructed, saw forests and meadows stretching into the distance. Then the feedback loop triggered. The scanner's hum became a shriek. The images in the archway began to fracture and multiply. Instead of showing one timeline, it was trying to display all possible timelines simultaneously. The temporal field expanded beyond its containment, washing over everyone in the room. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of being pulled through time, but this time she was ready for it. As reality dissolved around her, she used her knowledge of the device's workings to guide her temporal trajectory. Instead of being pulled forward into the collapsed future, she pushed herself backward, deeper into the past, to the moment when the scanner's components were first being manufactured. She materialized in a factory where the scanner's quantum processors were being assembled. Moving quickly, she introduced subtle flaws into the manufacturing process, tiny imperfections that would make it impossible to achieve the quantum coherence necessary for temporal manipulation. The processors would function perfectly for normal applications, but any attempt to breach the time barrier would result in immediate failure. She repeated this process at dozens of facilities, sabotaging every component that would eventually be used to build temporal technology. She altered research notes, introduced false data into quantum mechanics databases, and even arranged for key researchers to receive job offers that would take them away from temporal research. It was exhausting work that took her across decades of time, but eventually Elena was satisfied. No one in her era would be able to build a working temporal device for at least another century. By then, perhaps humanity would have gained enough wisdom to understand the dangers. As the scanner's overload finally consumed itself, Elena felt herself being pulled back to her own time. But this time, it was different. She was returning to a timeline where the scanner had never worked, where temporal research had been abandoned as an impossibility decades earlier. Eleanor opened her eyes to find herself lying on the floor of Laboratory 7. Dr. Webb was kneeling beside her, his face creased with concern. Around them, the remains of the scanner smoked quietly, its components fused into uselessness by the overload. "Elena, are you all right?" Webb asked. "The scanner malfunctioned during the test. Some kind of quantum cascade failure." Eleanor sat up slowly, her head spinning. The laboratory looked exactly as it had before her journey to the collapsed future, but she could sense the difference. The oppressive weight of impending paradox was gone. Time flowed naturally, unmarked by the temporal scarring that had existed in the other timeline. "The project?" she asked carefully. "What happens now?" Webb sighed and looked at the ruined device. "I'm afraid this setback will kill the funding." The oversight board was already sceptical, and after this failure, he shrugged. "Perhaps it's for the best. I've been having some doubts about the ethical implications of temporal research." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the man she'd once known, brilliant but cautious, ambitious but ethical. Without the scanner's success to feed his obsession, he remained the mentor she remembered. Over the following weeks, Eleanor watched as temporal research was quietly abandoned. The theoretical foundations she had sabotaged decades earlier made it clear that time travel was impossible, and after the scanner's spectacular failure, no one was willing to fund further experiments. She returned to her work in standard physics, publishing papers on quantum mechanics and relativity that would help advance human knowledge in safer directions. Sometimes, late at night, she would remember fragments of the collapsed timeline, Victoria's mechanical arm, Benedict's ancient eyes, the sight of cities flickering between centuries. She was the only person who remembered the refugees, the paradox beasts, the slow dissolution of causality itself. Sometimes the weight of those memories felt unbearable. She had saved reality, but at the cost of erasing people who had shown her kindness and courage in the face of impossible circumstances. But then she would see a child playing in the park, or watch the sunset paint the sky in natural colours, unmarred by temporal distortions, and she would know she had made the right choice. Years passed. Eleanor established herself as a respected physicist, though she carefully avoided any research that might lead back to temporal manipulation. She watched her younger colleagues make discoveries and propose theories, always alert for any sign that someone might stumble onto the principles that could restart the path to temporal disaster. On the 20th anniversary of the scanner incident, Eleanor was preparing to retire. She had spent 2 decades as guardian of a secret no one else could know, protector of a timeline that everyone else took for granted. She was tired, ready to pass the responsibility to time itself. That evening, as she was cleaning out her office, a young graduate student knocked on her door. Elena recognized her, Sarah Chen, one of the brightest students in the quantum physics program. Dr. Marrow, Sarah said excitedly. I was hoping to discuss my thesis proposal with you. I've been working on some theoretical frameworks for temporal observation, and I think I might have found a way to make it work. Eleanor's blood froze. She looked at the equations Sarah was showing her, and her heart sank. They were different from her own work, approached from a completely different theoretical angle, but Elena could see where they would lead. Given enough time and resources, these theories could result in a working temporal device. Elena thought of Victoria and Benedict, of the chrono refugees building their community in the ruins of causality. She thought of the paradox beasts and the temporal wounds that never healed. She thought of a future where time itself had collapsed into chaos. Sarah, she said gently, have you considered the philosophical implications of temporal observation? The ethical questions involved in witnessing events that the participants believed were private? Sarah's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. I hadn't really thought about that aspect. Elena spent the next hour carefully guiding the young woman towards safer research directions, planting seeds of doubt about temporal research without being too obvious about it. By the time Sarah left, she was excited about pursuing quantum computing applications instead. Eleanor locked her office door and walked out into the evening air. The stars shone clearly overhead, unmarked by the temporal distortions that would have existed in the collapsed timeline. She had bought humanity another generation, maybe two. But as she walked home, Elena wondered if she was fighting an inevitable battle. Curiosity was part of human nature. Someone, somewhere, would eventually develop the theories and technologies necessary for temporal manipulation. The knowledge was too alluring, the potential applications too tempting. Perhaps the real lesson wasn't that time travel should never be invented, but that humanity needed to mature before it could safely handle such power. The refugees in the collapsed timeline had shown remarkable resilience and compassion despite their circumstances. Maybe, given enough time to grow and learn, humanity could eventually develop temporal technology without destroying themselves. Elena reached her apartment and paused on the threshold, looking back at the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, another timeline existed where the scanner had worked, where she had travelled forward to witness the collapse of causality itself. In that timeline, brave people were still fighting to survive in the ruins of time. She'd given them the greatest gift she could. She'd made their suffering unnecessary. They would never exist to experience the collapse, would never need to build communities in the shattered remnants of reality, would never face the terror of paradox beasts or temporal flux waves. It was, she realized, the ultimate act of love. To sacrifice an entire timeline of connections and friendships to preserve the natural order of existence. Elena opened her door and stepped inside, carrying with her the memories of a future that would never come to pass and the knowledge that time for now was safe. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The storm hammered against the windows of the Whitmore mansion like an angry fist, each thunderclap making Maya jump as she pressed her face to the rain-streaked glass. The old Victorian house had been abandoned for decades, its Gothic towers and weathered shingles creating jagged silhouettes against the lightning-torn sky. Her friends had dared her to spend an hour inside during the storm, laughing as they drove away in Jake's car, leaving her alone with nothing but her phone's flashlight and her stubborn pride. The front door creaked open with surprising ease, as if the house itself was welcoming her inside. Dust particles danced in her phone's beam as she stepped into the foyer, her sneakers echoing against warped hardwood floors. Portraits of stern-faced men and women in elaborate wigs stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to track her movement through the shadows. The air smelled of mould and something else, something older, like parchment and forgotten secrets. Maya had always been drawn to history, spending countless hours reading about distant times and places, imagining what it would be like to walk through ancient Rome or witness the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But standing in this decaying monument to the past, she felt only an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Thunder crashed overhead, and Maya decided to explore deeper into the house. The basement door stood slightly ajar at the end of a narrow hallway, and she found herself drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming at her to leave. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended into the musty darkness below. The basement was a maze of stone walls and forgotten storage. Cobwebs draped like ghostly curtains from the ceiling, and rats scurried away from her light. Old furniture covered in dust sheets created strange shapes in the shadows, like sleeping giants waiting to wake. Maya picked her way carefully through the debris, fascination overcoming her fear. It was behind a stack of wine barrels, in the deepest corner of the basement, that she found it. At first it looked like just another section of the stone wall, but as she moved closer, her light revealed intricate carvings etched into what appeared to be an ancient wooden door. The symbols were unlike anything she'd seen before. Not quite Celtic, not quite French, but somehow familiar, as if she'd glimpsed them in dreams. The door had no visible handle, but when Maya pressed her palm against the central carving, a fleur-de-lis intertwined with a skeletal hand, it gave way with a deep, resonant click. Light erupted from the opening, not the harsh white of electricity, but something warmer, more alive, pulsing like a heartbeat made of gold and fire. The light pulled at her, and Maya felt her feet leave the ground. The basement, the storm, the entire world dissolved around her as she tumbled through radiance that sang with voices from another time. She awoke to the sound of shouting and the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Maya's head pounded as she struggled to her feet, finding herself in a cramped stone cellar, lit only by weak sunlight filtering through a barred window near the ceiling. Her modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a North Face jacket, felt alien against her skin as she realised she was no longer in the Whitmore basement. The shouting grew louder as she climbed a set of narrow stairs towards street level. When she pushed open a heavy wooden door, the assault on her senses was overwhelming. The street beyond was narrow and filthy, running with sewage and rotting garbage. Buildings leaned precariously over the cobblestones, their upper floors nearly touching across the alley. And everywhere, people pressed together in a seething mass of rage and desperation. Maya stepped into the crowd, immediately struck by their appearance. The people wore rough, patched clothing in shades of brown and grey. Many were gaunt with hunger, their eyes hollow and fierce. They carried makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, farming tools, clubs studded with nails, and their chants filled the air with terrifying energy. Mort aux aristocrates, Vive la République, Liberté ou la mort. Poster covered every available surface, many stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. Maya couldn't read the French, but the images were clear enough. Guillotines, severed heads, figures in elaborate dress being dragged toward their doom. Her stomach lurched as the reality of her situation began to sink in. A woman in a tattered dress shoved past her, screaming something about bread and justice. Maya stumbled backward, bumping into a man carrying a pitchfork. He turned toward her with suspicious eyes, taking in her strange clothing and clean appearance. "Qu'est-ce que c'est?" he snarled, grabbing her jacket. "Tu es aristocrate." Maya didn't speak French, but the menace in his voice was universal. Other faces turned toward her, expressions shifting from curiosity to hostility as they noticed her modern clothes and well-fed appearance. She looked nothing like the desperate, downtrodden people surrounding her. "Espionne!" someone shouted. "Spy! Austrian spy!" The crowd pressed closer, and Maya realised with growing terror that these people were ready to tear her apart with their bare hands. She broke free from the man's grip and ran, pushing through the mob as hands grabbed at her jacket and voices screamed accusations behind her. She burst into a larger square where vendors sold rotting vegetables and scraps of meat crawling with flies. The buildings here were grander but scarred with revolutionary graffiti and broken windows. Maya ducked behind a market stall, her heart hammering as she tried to make sense of what was happening. You're not from here?" The voice spoke English with a slight French accent. Maya spun around to find a boy about her age crouched beside a pile of empty crates. He was thin and dirty, dressed in patched breeches and a shirt that had once been white. His dark hair hung in greasy tangles, but his eyes were intelligent and kind. Who are you?" Maya gasped. "Name's Lucian," he said, glancing around nervously. "And you're in deep trouble, mademoiselle. Looking like that, talking like that. They'll have your head on a pike before sunset. My head on a... What year is this?" Lucian stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. 1793, of course. The year 2 of the Republic. Though I suppose if you're from England or Austria, you might not know our revolutionary calendar. The French Revolution. Maya's head spun as the pieces fell into place. The guillotines on the posters, the bloodthirsty crowds, the desperate poverty. She had somehow travelled back in time to one of the most violent periods in human history. "I need help," she whispered. "I don't belong here. I need to find a way home." Lucian studied her for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Come with me. Keep your mouth shut and do exactly what I say." He led her through a maze of back alleys, avoiding the main streets where revolutionaries marched with their banners and weapons. Maya tried to walk like Lucienne, hunched over, eyes down, moving with the furtive quickness of someone who lived in constant fear. "Here," Lucian said, pulling her into an abandoned building. "Take off that jacket. And those shoes, they scream aristocrat." Maya hesitated, but the memory of those hostile faces convinced her to comply. Lucian produced a grimy coat and wooden clogs from a pile of rags in the corner. "Better," he said as she struggled into the oversized garments. "Now rub some dirt on your face and hands, and whatever you do, don't speak unless absolutely necessary. Your accent will give you away in seconds." As Maya disguised herself, Lucian explained the situation. The revolution had devoured its own children, turning increasingly violent as factions fought for control. Anyone suspected of aristocratic sympathies faced the guillotine, and paranoia ran so deep that neighbours regularly denounced each other. "But why are you helping me?" Maya asked. Lucian's expression darkened. "My family were servants in a great house. When the revolution came, we thought things would get better for people like us. Instead, they got worse. The new masters are just as cruel as the old ones, maybe crueler, and I've heard stories, rumours about doors that lead to other times, other places. If such things exist, maybe there's hope for escape." "Doors to other times?" Maya's pulse quickened. "What kind of doors?" "Old stories, probably nonsense, but they say the ancient kings had secret passages, ways to flee when the people rose up. Some claim there's one hidden in the catacombs beneath the city, marked with royal symbols and protected by old magic, the catacombs." Maya remembered reading about the underground ossuaries that honeycombed Paris, filled with the bones of millions of dead. If there was a way back to her own time, it might be hidden in those ancient tunnels. "Can you take me there?" she asked. Before Lucian could answer, shouts erupted in the street outside. Through a broken window, Maya saw a procession approaching, soldiers in blue uniforms surrounding a cart filled with prisoners. At the front of the procession, a massive wooden scaffold on wheels dominated the street. The guillotine. Maya had seen drawings in history books, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of the killing machine. It towered above the crowd like a hungry giant, its angled blade gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. The wooden framework was stained dark with blood, and the crowd pressed close to get a better view as the executioner prepared for his work. The prisoners were dragged from the cart one by one, men and women in tattered finery, their faces pale with terror. Maya recognised the unmistakable bearing of aristocracy even in their defeated state. One woman, barely older than Maya herself, stumbled as she was forced up the scaffold steps. "Don't watch," Lucian whispered. But Maya couldn't look away. The crowd's bloodlust was palpable, their cheers growing louder as each head fell. Maya felt sick, but also transfixed by the raw savagery of it all. This wasn't the sanitised version of history she'd read about. This was real terror, real death, real human beings reduced to entertainment for the mob. A soldier spotted them in the window and pointed in their direction. Maya and Lucian scrambled away as boots thundered up the stairs toward their hiding place. "This way." Lucian grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a hole in the floor that led to the building's cellar. They dropped down just as soldiers burst into the room above. The cellar connected to a network of tunnels that seemed to extend throughout the neighbourhood. Lucian moved through them with practiced ease, leading Maya deeper underground until the sounds of the search party faded behind them. "We need to find that map," Lucian panted as they rested in a wider chamber. "There's a printing shop on Rue Saint-Antoine. They produce revolutionary pamphlets, but the owner is sympathetic to those seeking alternatives to the current situation." The printing shop was a cramped, chaotic space filled with the smell of ink and hot metal. The proprietor, a nervous man named Desailly, eyed them suspiciously until Lucian mentioned the catacombs. Then his expression changed to one of desperate hope. "You're not the first to ask about the old passages," he whispered, glancing around his shop as if spies might be hiding among the printing presses. "There are stories, legends of doors that lead to other realms, other times. The kings used them to escape their enemies, or so they say." He produced a pamphlet from beneath a stack of revolutionary newspapers. At first glance, it appeared to be another call to arms against the enemies of the Republic. But when Desailly held it up to the light, Maya could see faint lines beneath the printed text, a map of tunnels and chambers, marked with symbols that matched those she'd seen on the door in the Whitmore basement. "The cellar door of kings," Desailly breathed. "Hidden in the deepest part of the catacombs, where the bones of ancient royalty mingle with the common dead. They say it opens only for those who carry the proper key." Maya's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, where the brass key she'd found in the basement still rested. She hadn't even realised she'd brought it with her through the door. "We need to reach the catacombs," she told Lucian. "Tonight, before—" The shop door burst open, and 3 young people about Maya's age stumbled inside. But unlike Lucian, these street children had a harder edge, their eyes cold and calculating. "Well, well," one of them, a girl with matted blonde hair and a knife at her belt, looked Maya up and down. "This must be the foreign spy we've been hearing about." Lucian stepped protectively in front of Maya. "She's no spy, Margot. Just someone trying to survive like the rest of us." "Survive?" Margot laughed harshly. "Look at her hands, Lucian. Soft as a baby's. Look at her teeth. White and straight as nobles. This one's never known a day of real hardship in her life." The other street children spread out, blocking the exits. Maya realised with sick certainty that these were the allies Lucian had mentioned, his own people turning against him for the promise of reward. "The Committee of Public Safety is offering bread and meat for information about foreign agents," one of the boys said. "Enough food to last a month, maybe more." Maya saw the conflict in Lucian's face. He was starving too, she realised. They all were. In this world of revolutionary terror, betrayal was just another survival strategy. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but Maya was already moving. She grabbed the oil lamp from Desailly's desk and hurled it at the nearest window. Glass shattered, and burning oil splashed across the wooden floor. In the chaos that followed, Maya bolted through the broken window into the alley beyond. Behind her, she could hear Margot screaming orders to the others. Maya ran blindly through the narrow streets, her wooden clogs slipping on the wet cobblestones. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to reach the catacombs before the revolutionary authorities caught up with her. The entrance she found was nothing more than a crack in a cemetery wall, hidden behind a weathered statue of some forgotten saint. Maya squeezed through just as she heard boots pounding on the street behind her. The darkness beyond was absolute, broken only by the faint phosphorescent glow of bones embedded in the tunnel walls. The Paris catacombs were a city of the dead, stretching for miles beneath the living city above. Millions of skeletons lined the passages in elaborate patterns, walls of femurs topped by grinning skulls, archways made from rib cages, entire chambers where bones formed geometric designs of haunting beauty. Maya had read that the catacombs held the remains of 6 million people, transferred here from overcrowded cemeteries centuries ago. Now, as she stumbled through the bone-lined corridors with only her phone's fading battery for light, the statistics became viscerally real. She was surrounded by death on an unimaginable scale, walking through galleries where human remains had been transformed into macabre art. The map from Desailly's shop was crude, but it gave her some sense of direction. She needed to reach the oldest section, where royal remains were said to rest apart from the common dead. But the tunnels branched and twisted in confusing patterns, and more than once Maya found herself in dead ends, surrounded by walls of empty eye sockets that seemed to watch her every move. Voices echoed from the tunnels behind her, Lucian's former allies had followed her underground. Maya quickened her pace, trying to muffle her footsteps on the bone-strewn floor. Her phone battery was dying, the light growing dimmer with each passing minute. She almost missed it, a section of wall where the bones were arranged differently, forming patterns that matched the symbols on her map. The brass key in her pocket grew warm as she approached, and Maya realised she was close to her destination. The door was hidden behind centuries of accumulated skulls, but when Maya pressed the key against the central symbol, the bone wall swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond lay a chamber that predated the catacombs, rough stone walls carved with fleur-de-lis and crowned eagles, the forgotten tomb of some ancient French king. And there, at the far end of the chamber, stood another door. This one was identical to the portal in the Whitmore basement, down to the intricate carvings and the warm golden light that leaked around its edges. Maya was running toward it when the chamber filled with flickering torchlight. Her pursuers had found her. "Seize the spy!" Margot's voice echoed off the stone walls. "In the name of the Republic!" Maya reached the door just as hands grabbed her from behind. She struggled desperately, the brass key slipping from her fingers to clatter on the stone floor. More revolutionaries poured into the chamber, not just Margot's gang, but adult soldiers with muskets and fixed bayonets. They dragged her back through the catacombs and up into the nightmare world of revolutionary Paris. The sun was setting, casting the city in shades of blood and shadow. Crowds lined the streets, eager for another spectacle of revolutionary justice. Maya found herself in a makeshift courtroom in what had once been a grand salon. The judge was a gaunt man in a black coat, his eyes burning with fanatic fervour. Behind him hung a banner reading La mort ou la liberté, death or liberty. "Citizen Maya," he intoned, reading from a document that someone had hastily prepared. "You stand accused of espionage against the Republic, of conspiracy with enemies of the people, and of attempting to aid the escape of traitors and aristocrats." Maya tried to speak, to explain that she wasn't a spy, wasn't even from this time, but every word that came out of her mouth only seemed to damn her further. Her accent, her confusion about basic revolutionary principles, her inability to name any other patriots, all of it pointed to guilt in the judge's mind. "The penalty for espionage is death," he declared as the crowd cheered. "The prisoner will be taken to the Place de la Révolution and executed at dawn." They locked her in a cell beneath the courthouse, a stone box barely large enough for her to lie down. Through the barred window she could hear the crowds gathering for tomorrow's entertainment. Vendors were already setting up stalls to sell food and drink to the spectators who would come to watch her die. Maya curled up on the filthy straw and tried to think. The brass key was gone, lost somewhere in the ancient royal tomb. Even if she could escape her cell, she had no way to open the door back to her own time. She was trapped in 1793, destined to become another casualty of the revolution's insatiable appetite for blood. As the night wore on, she heard other prisoners being brought in, men and women whose only crime was being born into the wrong social class or expressing the wrong political opinion. Some wept, others prayed, and a few maintained their dignity even in the face of certain death. Maya found their courage both inspiring and heartbreaking. Dawn came with the sound of drums and marching feet. The guards unlocked her cell and dragged her out into the grey morning light. The street leading to the Place de la Révolution was packed with spectators, men, women and children all eager to see the enemies of the Republic meet their fate. The guillotine stood in the centre of the square like a mechanical god, its blade catching the first rays of sunlight. The crowd pressed close, their faces twisted with bloodlust and revolutionary fervour. Maya had read about mob psychology, but experiencing it firsthand was terrifying beyond anything she could have imagined. They forced her up onto the scaffold and Maya could see the basket below, dark with dried blood from previous executions. The executioner was a massive man in a leather apron, his arms stained to the elbows. He grabbed Maya's shoulders, preparing to force her down onto the wooden bench. That was when the riot started. It began with a fight between two spectators over the best viewing position. Within seconds it had spread throughout the crowd as revolutionary factions turned on each other with the same violence they directed at their supposed enemies. Guards abandoned their posts to join the fighting, and in the chaos Maya found herself momentarily forgotten. She rolled off the scaffold and crawled beneath the guillotine's wooden platform. Above her the sounds of battle grew louder. Screams, gunshots, the crash of breaking glass and splintering wood. The revolution was devouring itself, just as she'd read in history books. It was then that she noticed the symbols carved into the guillotine's base, the same royal markings she'd seen in the catacombs and on the door in the Whitmore basement. The brass key in her pocket began to glow with warm light, and Maya realised that the executions had been taking place directly above another portal. The key fit perfectly into a hidden slot beneath the guillotine's mechanism. As Maya turned it, the wooden platform split open, revealing stairs that led down into golden radiance. She didn't hesitate. Behind her, the mob was fighting with increasing savagery, and she knew that her execution had only been delayed, not cancelled. The light enveloped her as she tumbled down the steps, and Maya felt the same sensation of dissolution she'd experienced in the Whitmore basement. The sounds of revolutionary Paris, drums, screams, the crash of the guillotine blade, faded into silence as she fell through time itself. She landed hard on the dusty floor of the abandoned basement, her phone clattering away into the darkness. For a long moment, Maya lay still, hardly daring to believe she was really back in her own time. The storm was still raging outside, but after the terror of revolutionary Paris, it sounded almost peaceful. Maya struggled to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt from the catacombs, and she could smell smoke and blood on her skin. But she was alive. She was home, and the nightmare was over. As she climbed the basement stairs, Maya's hand encountered something crumpled in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and stared in amazement at a blood-stained revolutionary pamphlet, its French text calling for the execution of enemies of the Republic. Physical proof that her journey through time had been real, not just some elaborate hallucination brought on by the storm and the eerie atmosphere of the old house. Maya slammed the basement door behind her and ran through the Whitmore mansion toward the exit. Behind her, she could swear she heard the faint echo of revolutionary songs and the rhythmic thump of the guillotine blade. The house seemed to pulse with hidden energies, as if the very walls remembered the doorway she'd opened and the terrible time she'd visited. She burst through the front door into the storm, grateful for the clean rain on her face and the familiar sight of streetlights and power lines. Her friends were waiting in Jake's car, having returned to check on her after the storm intensified. "Maya," Sarah called out, "are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maya climbed into the back seat, still clutching the revolutionary pamphlet. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make them understand that she'd witnessed one of history's most violent periods, that she'd felt the guillotine's shadow fall across her own neck? "Just a weird old house," she said finally, "full of strange echoes." As they drove away, Maya stared back at the Whitmore mansion through the rain-streaked window. For just a moment, she thought she saw light flickering in the basement windows, warm, golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the house disappeared behind the trees, and Maya forced herself to look forward, toward her own time and her own life. But late at night, when she was alone in her room, she would take out the blood-stained pamphlet and read its revolutionary slogans. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she could swear she heard the distant sound of drums and the echo of crowds chanting for liberty or death. The past, it seemed, was never really past. It lived on in the spaces between moments, waiting for the right door to be opened, the right key to be turned. Maya kept the pamphlet hidden in her desk drawer, alongside the brass key that had somehow returned to her pocket during the journey home. She never spoke of what she'd experienced, but she found herself drawn to study the French Revolution with new intensity, reading every account of the terror she could find. The names became personal now: Robespierre, Marat, Charlotte Corday. She had walked among their shadows, breathed the same air, felt the same terror that had gripped all of France during those bloody years. Sometimes she wondered about Lucien, and whether he had survived the violence that consumed so many of his generation. She wondered about Margot and the other street children, about Desailly the printer, and all the unnamed faces in the revolutionary crowds. History books recorded the grand sweep of events, but they could never capture the individual human cost. The fear in a young girl's eyes as she faced the guillotine, the desperate hunger that drove people to betray their friends, the way terror could transform ordinary citizens into bloodthirsty monsters. The Whitmore mansion was demolished 6 months later, its Victorian grandeur erased to make room for a shopping centre. Maya read about it in the local newspaper, studying the photograph of bulldozers reducing the old house to rubble. The basement where she'd found the door was filled with concrete, sealing whatever portal had existed there beneath tons of modern construction. But Maya knew that time was more flexible than people realised, that the past and present existed simultaneously in ways that defied rational explanation. Somewhere beneath the busy shops and parking lots, in dimensions that curved back on themselves like cosmic doorways, the French Revolution continued to rage. The guillotine still fell, the crowd still called for blood, and the door of kings still waited for the right person with the right key to step through and witness history in all its terrible glory. Maya kept the brass key on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothing where no one could see it. She told herself it was just a memento, a reminder of an impossible experience that had shaped her understanding of human nature and historical truth. But sometimes, when she held it in her palm, she could feel it growing warm with mysterious energy, as if it were calling her back to other times, other places where the doors between worlds stood slightly ajar. She never answered that call. Once was enough. The French Revolution had taught her that some knowledge came at too high a price, that witnessing history firsthand meant accepting responsibility for the truth of human suffering and the fragility of civilization itself. Maya would carry that knowledge with her always, the weight of what she'd seen, the echo of guillotine drums that would follow her through all the quiet nights of her ordinary, precious modern life. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Marcus Chen had always been the quiet one in his junior class, the kid who preferred ancient history documentaries to video games, who could recite Roman emperors in chronological order, but struggled to remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. So when Mrs. Davidson announced their field trip to the Metropolitan Museum's new Roman exhibition, he was the first to sign up and the last to complain when the bus broke down, extending their visit by 3 hours. While his classmates clustered around the interactive displays, snapping selfies with marble statues and complaining about the smell of old stone, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the quieter sections of the exhibit. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across glass cases filled with ancient weapons, jewellery and pottery. He moved methodically from display to display, reading every placard, studying every artefact as if it might reveal some secret the museum curators had missed. It was in the farthest corner of the Roman military section that he found it, a bronze helmet, its surface green with age and marked by a spiderweb of hairline cracks that seemed to pulse in the shifting light. Unlike the other pristine artefacts, this one looked battle-worn, authentic in a way that made his chest tighten with inexplicable recognition. The placard read, "Gladiator's Helmet, circa 80 CE, origin unknown, recently acquired from a private collection. Note the unusual bronze composition and mysterious inscriptions along the crown." Marcus pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The helmet seemed to call to him, and without fully realising what he was doing, he found his hand reaching out. The security guard was distracted, helping an elderly visitor, and the case's motion sensors had been acting up all day according to the maintenance worker he'd overheard earlier. His fingertips touched the cool bronze and the world exploded. The museum floor tilted, the walls spun like a carnival ride, and a sound like thunder filled his ears. Colours bled together, the white of marble statues, the gold of Roman coins, the red of painted frescoes, all swirling into a vortex that pulled him down, down, down into darkness. When consciousness returned, it came with the taste of dust and the smell of human sweat mixed with animal waste. Marcus groaned, his head pounding as he tried to focus his eyes. Stone walls surrounded him, rough-hewn and stained with what looked like old blood. Straw covered the floor, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the clash of metal on metal, punctuated by shouted commands in a language he somehow understood but knew he shouldn't. Latin. They were speaking Latin. He sat up slowly, his modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a New York Giants hoodie, completely out of place in what appeared to be some sort of cell. The bronze helmet sat beside him, no longer cracked but gleaming as if freshly forged, somehow attached to his backpack by leather cords that definitely hadn't been there before. By Jupiter's beard! What manner of slave is this? The voice boomed from the cell's entrance, where a massive Roman soldier stood studying him with suspicious eyes. 2 more soldiers flanked him, their armour catching the torchlight that flickered from sconces along the corridor beyond. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm not a slave," he said, then realised he'd spoken in Latin without thinking. How was that possible? The lead soldier laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Not a slave? Then explain your strange garments and that sacred helmet of Mercurius. You're either a runaway gladiator or a very poor thief." He gestured to the other soldiers. "Bring him to Dr. Brutus. If he's a fighter, he'll earn his keep. If not..." He shrugged, the implication clear. They dragged him through a maze of corridors that opened into a vast training ground under the open sky. The Ludus Magnus, his history-obsessed brain supplied automatically. The great gladiator school of Rome. Sand covered the practice area, darkened in patches with old blood, and wooden weapons lined the walls. Dozens of men moved through combat drills, their bodies scarred and muscled, their eyes holding the flat wariness of those who lived each day knowing it might be their last. At the centre of it all stood a man who could only be Dr. Brutus. Tall, lean, with arms like iron bands and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and when he smiled at Marcus's approach, it was the expression of a wolf sizing up prey. "Another gift from our generous patron," Brutus said, circling Marcus like a predator. "What fighting experience do you have, boy?" "Fighting experience?" Marcus's voice cracked. I don't fight. I'm a student. There's been some kind of mistake." Brutus backhanded him casually, the blow sending Marcus sprawling into the sand. Blood filled his mouth, and his vision blurred. "Everyone fights here," Brutus said conversationally. "The only question is whether you fight well enough to live through tomorrow." He nudged Marcus with his foot. "Get up. Let's see what you're made of." The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and confusion. They thrust wooden weapons into his hands, first a gladius, then a spear, then a net and trident combination that nearly tangled him into unconsciousness. Each time he failed to meet Brutus's standards, which seemed to involve not dying immediately, the doctor would demonstrate the proper technique by beating Marcus with ruthless efficiency. "You move like a city boy," Brutus observed after Marcus had failed to block a simple sword thrust for the dozenth time. "Soft hands, soft mind. But..." He tilted his head, studying Marcus with new interest. "You learn quickly, and you see attacks before they come. Interesting." It was true, Marcus realised with surprise. After the initial shock wore off, some survival instinct had kicked in. He found himself anticipating Brutus's moves, not through skill but through pattern recognition. The same ability that helped him ace history tests was letting him read the subtle tells that preceded each attack. It wasn't enough to make him competent, but it was enough to keep him breathing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the training ground, another gladiator approached their practice area. He was young, maybe 20, with the pale complexion and blue eyes of someone from the Northern Territories. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso, but his movements held a fluid grace that spoke of years of training. "Doctore," the young man said, bowing slightly, "I am Gaius Valerius Maximus, though the men call me Valerius." "I heard you had a new recruit," Brutus grunted, "if you can call him that." "Darius, this is Valerius. He'll show you to your quarters and explain the rules. Try not to get yourself killed before your first real fight. I've got money riding on you lasting at least a week." Valerius helped Marcus to his feet, his grip strong but gentle. "Come," he said quietly. "You look ready to collapse." The gladiator quarters were sparse but clean. Long barracks lined with simple beds, each man's possessions limited to what could fit in a small wooden chest. Valerius led him to an empty bed near the back, away from the clusters of men who watched their arrival with calculating eyes. "You're not what they think you are," Valerius said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. Marcus considered lying, then decided on a version of the truth. "I'm lost. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know how to get home. And the helmet..." Marcus touched the bronze artifact still secured to his pack. Up close, he could see the inscriptions the museum placard had mentioned. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "I found it. Or it found me. I think it's connected to why I'm here." Valerius nodded slowly. "The men have been talking about it. They say it's the helmet of Mercurius, that it brings victory to whoever wears it in the arena." The last man who owned it won 12 fights in a row before he earned his freedom. What happened to him? He tried to leave Rome. They found him 3 days later with his throat cut. Valerius's expression was grim. Freedom is rarely what they promise us it will be. Over the following days, Marcus learned the brutal rhythm of gladiator life. Dawn brought training, endless hours of sword work, spear fighting, and hand-to-hand combat that left his muscles screaming and his hands raw despite the cloth wrappings they gave him. Midday meant rest, food, and medical attention for the inevitable injuries. Afternoons brought more training, this time focused on specific fighting styles and arena tactics. The other gladiators remained suspicious of him, but Valerius proved to be a patient teacher and gradually a friend. He'd been captured during a raid on his village in Gaul 3 years earlier, and unlike many of the others who'd been broken by their circumstances, he maintained a quiet dignity and a stubborn hope that someday he'd see his homeland again. The trick, he told Marcus one evening as they tended to their wounds, is to remember who you were before this place tried to remake you. The moment you forget that, you become just another animal fighting for scraps. But not everyone was as accepting as Valerius. A gladiator named Quintus, a bull of a man with arms like tree trunks and a disposition to match, had taken an immediate dislike to Marcus. Perhaps it was jealousy over the attention the mysterious helmet generated, or maybe it was simple predatory instinct targeting the weakest member of the pack. Whatever the reason, he made Marcus's life miserable with a creativity that would have been impressive if it weren't so vicious. Strange clothes, strange speech, strange weapons, Quintus would mutter just loud enough for others to hear. Mark my words, there's something unnatural about this one. The gods don't favour pretenders. 2 weeks into his captivity, Marcus got his first taste of what waited for him beyond the training ground. They marched the gladiators through underground tunnels that reeked of fear and death. Emerging into the Hippodrome, the vast network of chambers and corridors beneath the Colosseum's arena floor. The sound hit him first. 50,000 voices creating a wall of noise that seemed to press against his chest. Then came the smells, sweat, blood, exotic animals, and the peculiar mixture of perfume and wine that marked the Roman elite in their seats high above. "Remember," Valerius whispered as they waited in the holding area, "the crowd loves a good show more than they love death. Give them drama, make them cheer, and you might live to see another sunset." Marcus's first opponent was a thin man with the hollow eyes of someone who'd already given up. They handed him wooden weapons, training gear that could still kill but was less likely to produce the spectacular arterial sprays that marked the more prestigious matches. His opponent wielded a net and trident, the retiarius fighting style, while Marcus found himself with a gladius and small shield, the basic secutor loadout. The gate lifted, and suddenly he was on the sand, the roar of the crowd crashing over him like a physical force. The Colosseum stretched impossibly high above him, tier upon tier of faces all focused on the small circle of sand where he stood trying not to vomit from terror. His opponent attacked immediately, the trident punching forward with surprising speed. Marcus stumbled backward, muscle memory from his training with Brutus taking over, where conscious thought failed. The net came next, and he barely managed to duck under it, the weights along its edge whistling past his ear. What saved him was his complete lack of formal training. Where an experienced gladiator would have followed predictable patterns, Marcus fought with the desperate creativity of someone who'd never learned the proper way to die. When the trident came again, instead of trying to block it with his shield, he grabbed a handful of sand and flung it at his opponent's eyes. While the man staggered, momentarily blinded, Marcus closed the distance and tackled him to the ground. They wrestled in the sand, the crowd's roar intensifying. Marcus had maybe 15 pounds and definitely several years on his opponent, but the man fought with the viciousness of someone who knew defeat meant death. Fingers clawed at Marcus's eyes, knees drove toward his groin, teeth snapped at any exposed flesh. In the end, it was Marcus's modern sensibilities that won the fight. Where his opponent expected him to go for a killing blow, Marcus instead trapped the man's arm in a wrestling hold he'd learned from YouTube videos, applying pressure until the man's shoulder made a wet popping sound, and he screamed in surrender. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered the unexpected tactics, others booed what they saw as an unsatisfying conclusion. But Emperor Domitian, presiding over the games from the imperial box, raised his thumb. mercy. Both fighters would live. As guards led them back to the hippodrome, Marcus's opponent grabbed his arm with his good hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "My family. They needed me to survive today." That night, back in the Ludus, the other gladiators treated Marcus differently. Not with respect exactly, but with the acknowledgement that he was no longer just meat waiting to be butchered. He'd proven he could survive, and in their world, that was the only currency that mattered. "You fought smart," Valerius said, helping him clean a cut on his forearm. "But next time they'll give you a real opponent. Someone with skill, not just desperation." Marcus nodded, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. As they talked, he noticed the bronze helmet seemed to glow more brightly than before, the inscriptions more distinct. It was reacting to something. The violence, the crowd's energy, or perhaps his own brush with death. Whatever it was, he could feel it building towards something, like a battery slowly charging. His second fight came 3 weeks later, and this time there was no mercy in the selection. His opponent was Lucius Aurelius, a veteran gladiator with 2 years of arena experience and 17 confirmed kills. Unlike Marcus's first fight, this one was scheduled as a true contest. Real weapons, real consequences, and the clear expectation that only one man would walk away. The night before the fight, Quintus cornered him in the latrines. "Tomorrow you die," the big gladiator said conversationally, "but before you do, I want that helmet. Hand it over now, and I'll make sure your death is quick." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The helmet chooses its bearer." Quintus laughed. "Superstitious nonsense. It's bronze and leather, nothing more." His hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "Give it to me, or I'll take it from your corpse." Before Marcus could respond, Valerius appeared in the doorway, his own blade already drawn. "Is there a problem here?" The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap, then Quintus shrugged and backed away. "No problem. We were just discussing tomorrow's entertainment," but Marcus could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the patient hunger of a predator willing to wait for the right moment to strike. The next morning brought the familiar ritual, the march through the tunnels, the growing roar of the crowd, the final moments of preparation in the holding chambers. This time, though, Marcus strapped on the bronze helmet, feeling its weight settle onto his shoulders like destiny itself. Lucius Aurelius was everything Marcus was not. Tall, perfectly muscled, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd made killing into an art form. He carried a gladius and large shield, the classic gladiator configuration, and when he looked at Marcus across the arena, his smile held the warmth of winter in Germania. The fight began like a dance, both men circling, testing distance and timing. Aurelius was patient, content to let Marcus make the first mistake, while Marcus tried to apply everything Valerius and Brutus had taught him about reading an opponent. When Aurelius finally attacked, it was with a speed that made Marcus's previous opponent look like he'd been moving through honey. The gladius came in a perfect thrust aimed at Marcus's heart, and only the helmet's strange influence, a kind of premonition that came as a tingling along his scalp, gave him enough warning to twist aside. The blade scored along his ribs, drawing a line of fire that made him gasp, but he managed to get his own sword up in time to block the follow-up cut. The crowd roared its approval. They could sense they were watching a real contest. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Marcus's life. Aurelius pressed his attack with methodical precision, each strike designed to wear down Marcus's defence until the inevitable killing blow could land. Marcus gave ground steadily, his breathing becoming laboured, his arms starting to burn from the constant defensive work. But something strange was happening. The helmet seemed to be feeding him information, not quite thoughts, but impressions, instincts that had no business being in a 16-year-old's head. He began to see patterns in Aurelius's attacks, to anticipate not just the next strike, but the one after that. When Aurelius overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust, Marcus stepped inside his guard and drove his elbow into the veteran's solar plexus. It was a modern fighting technique, one that no gladiator would expect, and Aurelius doubled over, gasping for air. Marcus could have killed him then, should have killed him, according to the crowd's increasing bloodthirsty chants. Instead, he stepped back, giving Aurelius time to recover, a mistake that nearly cost him everything. The veteran came up from his crouch with a hidden dagger, the blade streaking toward Marcus's throat in a move that would have ended the fight instantly. But the helmet's influence was stronger now, its bronze surface actually glowing in the afternoon sunlight, and Marcus moved with inhuman speed to catch Aurelius's wrist just inches from his neck. They stood locked together for a heartbeat, the dagger trembling between them, and Marcus could see surprise and something like fear in Aurelius's eyes. Then Marcus twisted, using leverage instead of strength, and the dagger went spinning across the sand. This time he didn't hesitate. His gladius found the gap in Aurelius's armour, sliding between ribs to pierce the man's heart. Aurelius looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then up at Marcus, and smiled. "Well fought," he whispered, and died. The crowd went insane. Marcus had not just beaten a veteran gladiator, he'd done it with style, with drama, with the kind of unexpected reversals that made for legendary arena stories. Coins rained down from the stands, and somewhere in the imperial box Emperor Domitian was nodding his approval. But Marcus barely heard any of it. The helmet was singing in his mind now, its bronze surface blazing with an inner fire that he could feel, but that somehow didn't burn him. Power flowed through it, not just the energy of the crowd's adulation, but something deeper, older, connected to forces that existed long before Rome rose from the Seven Hills. That night, back in the gladiator quarters, the celebration was muted by the reality of their situation. Aurelius had been well liked, and his death cast a shadow over what should have been a victory feast. "You're changing," Valerius observed as they sat apart from the others. "The helmet, it's doing something to you." Marcus touched the bronze artifact, which had returned to its normal appearance but still hummed with latent energy. "I can feel it building towards something. Each fight, each moment of danger, it gets stronger. And what happens when it reaches full strength? I think it takes me home." Marcus looked around the torchlit barracks, at the scarred men who'd become his unlikely family, and felt a pang of guilt. "I think it always takes me home." But Quintus had been listening from the shadows, and that night, when the others slept, he made his move. Marcus woke to the sensation of the helmet being lifted from beside his bed, and opened his eyes to see Quintus's bulk silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. The big gladiator moved with surprising stealth for his size, but the helmet's absence had broken whatever spell of sleep Marcus had been under. "I warned you," Quintus whispered, when he realised Marcus was awake. "It should have been mine from the beginning." Marcus rolled off his bed, coming to his feet in a crouch, but Quintus was already moving toward the exit. The other gladiators stirred but didn't wake. Exhaustion was a constant companion in the ludus, and they'd learned to sleep through minor disturbances. Chase or let it go. The smart choice was clear. Quintus was bigger, stronger, and armed with the desperate fury of someone who'd finally seen his chance at glory. But without the helmet, Marcus was just another piece of meat in the arena. And more than that, the artifact had become his anchor, his only connection to home and the life he'd been torn away from. He followed Quintus through the dark corridors of the ludus, moving as quietly as he could on bare feet. The big gladiator was heading for the arena, probably hoping to claim the helmet's power in the place where it would be strongest. Marcus caught up with him just as he was entering the tunnel system beneath the Colosseum. "Give it back," Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Quintus turned, the helmet clutched against his chest like a trophy. In the torchlight, his face looked wild, desperate. "I've been fighting for 3 years," he snarled. 3 years of blood and pain and watching lesser men win glory that should have been mine. This is my chance." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus said, edging closer. "The helmet, it's not just about victory. There's something else. Something connected to—" Quintus's roar cut him off, and suddenly the big man was charging, using the helmet like a shield, while his other hand drew a gladius from his belt. Marcus dove aside, rolling across the stone floor as the blade sparked off the wall where his head had been. They fought through the labyrinthine passages beneath the arena, a desperate running battle lit by flickering torches and echoing with the sounds of their breathing and the ring of metal on stone. Quintus had the advantages of size and strength, but Marcus was faster and more familiar with fighting in confined spaces, a skill he'd never imagined he'd need in his suburban New Jersey life. The chase led them up through the beast pens, where the exotic animals destined for tomorrow's games paced in their cages. A tiger snarled as they ran past. Somewhere in the darkness, a lion coughed like thunder. The animal handlers had fled at the first sounds of combat, leaving Marcus and Quintus alone with creatures that could smell blood and fear with predatory accuracy. "You can't escape!" Quintus shouted, his voice ragged with exertion. "I know these tunnels better than you know your own dreams." It was probably true, but Marcus had something Quintus didn't. The helmet's influence, even at a distance, still provided him with flashes of insight, premonitions of danger that kept him one step ahead of his pursuer. When Quintus tried to ambush him in the weapons storage area, Marcus sensed the attack coming and rolled aside just as the gladius punched through the space where he'd been standing. The fight moved into the arena proper, emerging from the hippodrome into the vast oval of sand under the star-filled Roman sky. Without the crowd, the Colosseum felt impossibly large, empty, haunted by the ghosts of all who'd died there. The sand was still dark in places with dried blood from the day's games, and the weapons and shields scattered around the arena's edge gleamed in the moonlight. Quintus had grabbed a shield to go with his sword, making him a formidable opponent even without the helmet's power. Marcus armed himself with a trident and net, the retiarius configuration he'd faced in his first fight, and they began to circle each other on the blood-soaked sand. "Last chance," Quintus called out. "Surrender now and I'll make it quick." Instead of answering, Marcus cast his net, the weighted edges spreading wide as it flew through the air. Quintus knocked it aside with his shield, but it bought Marcus the second he needed to close distance with his trident. They fought under the stars, their battle witnessed only by the marble statues of emperors and gods that looked down from the arena's walls. Quintus was the better swordsman, but Marcus had desperation on his side, and more importantly, he could feel the helmet calling to him, its power growing stronger as violence filled the space around it. The turning point came when Quintus overcommitted to an attack, swinging his gladius in a wide arc that would have taken Marcus's head off if it had connected. Instead, Marcus ducked under the blade and drove his trident forward, its 3 prongs punching through Quintus's shield and into the arm that held it. Quintus screamed and dropped the shield, but instead of pressing his advantage, he threw the helmet as hard as he could toward the far side of the arena. "If I can't have it," he snarled, "then no one can!" The bronze artifact tumbled through the air, catching starlight on its polished surface, and landed in the sand near the arena's eastern wall. Both men ran for it, but Quintus had longer legs and less distance to cover. He reached the helmet first, scooping it up and placing it on his head with a triumphant laugh. "Now," he said, turning to face Marcus with the gladius ready in his good hand, "let's see what victory tastes like." The helmet blazed to life on his head, its bronze surface glowing like a small sun, and Marcus felt his heart sink. Whatever power the artifact possessed, Quintus now commanded it. But something was wrong. Instead of the confident smile Marcus expected, Quintus's face showed confusion, then alarm, then outright terror. The helmet's glow was intensifying, and Marcus could see that it was burning the big gladiator, the bronze somehow heating to unbearable temperatures against his skull. "Get it off!" Quintus screamed, clawing at the helmet with both hands. "Get it off me!" But the artifact wouldn't come free. It had fused itself to his head, and the more he struggled, the brighter it glowed. Marcus could smell burning flesh now, could see smoke rising from where the bronze met skin. "It chooses its bearer," Marcus said softly, remembering what he'd told Quintus earlier. "You can't just take it." Quintus fell to his knees, his screams echoing off the arena walls. The helmet's glow was blinding now, and Marcus had to shield his eyes as he approached the writhing figure. When the light finally faded, Quintus was dead, the helmet resting innocuously in the sand beside his burned corpse. Marcus picked it up carefully, expecting it to be hot, but the bronze was cool to the touch, almost soothing against his palms. He placed it on his head, feeling the familiar weight settle around his temples, and immediately the world shifted into sharper focus. He could sense things, movements in the darkness beyond the arena, the rhythm of sleeping hearts in the ludus, the vast presence of Rome itself sprawling endlessly in all directions. And something else, a pulling sensation, gentle but insistent, tugging at the edges of his consciousness like a tide that was just beginning to turn. The helmet was ready. It had absorbed enough violence, enough blood, enough desperate human emotion to power whatever temporal mechanism had brought him here. All it needed was one more push, one final moment of absolute peril to complete the circuit and carry him home. Above him, torches appeared along the arena's walls as guards responded to the sounds of fighting. Soon they'd be down on the sand, and there would be questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't allay. He had perhaps minutes before his window of opportunity closed forever. Marcus looked down at Quintus's body, at the peaceful expression death had given him, and felt an unexpected pang of sorrow. The man had been brutal, yes, but he'd also been trapped in the same system that had claimed so many others, slaves, criminals, and conquered peoples, all ground up in the machinery of Roman entertainment. "I'm sorry," he said to the corpse, and meant it. Then he picked up Quintus's fallen gladius and held it to his own throat. The blade was sharp enough to part skin with just the slightest pressure, and a drop of blood ran down his neck as he pressed the edge against his carotid artery. This was the moment the helmet had been waiting for. Not just violence, but the absolute certainty of death. The crystalline instant when life balanced on a razor's edge. The world exploded into light. Reality folded in on itself like origami made of pure energy, and Marcus felt himself pulled through dimensions that had no names, across distances that couldn't be measured in any earthly units. The Colosseum vanished, ancient Rome disappeared, and for a timeless moment he floated in a space between spaces, where the only constants were his own consciousness and the bronze helmet that anchored him to himself. Then the museum floor was solid beneath his feet, and he was standing exactly where he'd been when this impossible journey began, in front of the glass display case, staring at the cracked bronze helmet that looked exactly as it had before, almost exactly. Marcus stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unsteady, and realized he was still wearing the helmet. But even as he watched, it began to change, the bright bronze tarnishing and developing the same green patina and hairline cracks as the museum piece. Within seconds, it was indistinguishable from the artifact in the display case, except that one was in his hands and the other was behind glass. He looked around frantically, expecting to see security guards rushing toward him, but the museum was exactly as he'd left it. Mrs. Davidson was still discussing Roman architecture with a group of students near the front entrance. His classmates were still taking selfies with marble statues. No time seemed to have passed at all, but when he looked down at himself, the evidence of his impossible adventure was written across his body. Sand filled his shoes, not the fine, clean sand of a modern beach, but the coarse, blood-dark sand of an arena floor. His clothes were torn in places he didn't remember tearing them, and beneath the New York Giants hoodie, fresh scars traced the paths where Roman steel had found its mark. Most convincing of all was what he pulled from his pocket, a silver denarius bearing the profile of Emperor Domitian, minted in the year 81 CE according to the inscription around the edge. The coin was real, authentic, valuable enough to fund his college education if he chose to sell it. But he wouldn't sell it, just like he wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been or what he'd seen. Who would believe him? And more importantly, some experiences were too profound to be reduced to mere stories. Marcus carefully placed the helmet he'd brought back into his backpack, then turned away from the display case. As he walked toward the museum exit, he could feel the bronze artifact's weight against his back. Not heavy, but significant, like carrying a piece of history that was also a piece of himself. Outside, the afternoon sun felt different on his skin. Warmer, more precious, laden with the knowledge that each moment of peace was a gift that could be snatched away without warning. He'd lived through humanity at its most brutal and most noble, had seen the courage and cruelty that dwelt side by side in the human heart, and somehow survived to carry that knowledge home. The bus was fixed by the time he rejoined his classmates, and the ride back to school passed in a blur of familiar suburban landscapes that looked impossibly green and clean after the dust and stones of ancient Rome. His friends chattered about the exhibits they'd seen, complained about the length of the trip, made plans for the weekend that stretched ahead of them like an unlimited horizon. Marcus listened to it all with the patient attention of someone who had learned not to take ordinary moments for granted. In his backpack the bronze helmet rested quietly, its power spent but its presence still comforting. He was home, but he was also forever changed. A modern teenager who carried the memories of a gladiator, a survivor who had learned the true weight of both victory and mercy. That night, alone in his room, He took the helmet out and held it up to the light from his desk lamp. The inscriptions along its crown were visible again, the mysterious symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. But now he thought he understood what they meant, or at least what they represented. They were a promise and a warning, written in a language older than Latin, older than Greek, older perhaps than human civilization itself. They spoke of the doors that existed between moments, the paths that connected all times and places for those brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk them. Marcus placed the helmet carefully in the back of his closet, behind winter clothes that wouldn't be needed for months. Someday, maybe, he'd be ready to wear it again. But for now, he was content to be exactly where and when he was, a 16-year-old boy in 21st century America, with homework to do, and a life to live, and all the time in the world to figure out who he wanted to become. Outside his window, the suburban night was peaceful and predictable, filled with the gentle sounds of a world that had never known the roar of 50,000 voices calling for blood. But in the darkness of his closet, the bronze helmet waited with infinite patience, holding within its cracked surface the echoes of distant thunder and the promise of adventures yet to come. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The aurora blazed across the Los Angeles sky like digital fire, streaks of green and violet that shouldn't have existed this far south. Ethan Reyes adjusted his jury-rigged VR headset one more time, the solar panels he'd grafted onto its sides catching the last rays of October sunlight filtering through the eucalyptus trees of Griffith Park. His phone was propped against a rock, live streaming to maybe 12 people who cared about his quantum gaming revolution project. "Okay, chat, we're about to push this thing to 11, he said, voice crackling with nervous energy. Solar batteries at 96%, geomagnetic readings are off the charts, and he squinted at his smartwatch. Holy shit, the magnetometer's going crazy. This storm's hitting harder than predicted. The headset's weight felt familiar on his skull, cables snaking down to the makeshift battery pack at his waist. Months of salvaged electronics, YouTube tutorials, and stubborn determination had led to this moment. While his classmates were grinding through senior year applications, Ethan was trying to crack the code of consciousness itself, or at least build something cool enough to go viral. Initiating full-spectrum neural mapping in 3, 2... The world exploded into kaleidoscopic fragments. Colours that had no names shrieked across his vision as every nerve ending caught fire. The aurora above seemed to reach down with crackling fingers, and Ethan felt himself falling through dimensions of light and time, his scream lost in a cosmic wind that tasted of ozone and eternity, then darkness, then cold, then the gentle slap of waves against his face. Ethan's eyes fluttered open to find himself sprawled on wet sand beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars. The aurora was gone, replaced by a moon so bright it cast sharp shadows across pristine beach. His VR headset lay in pieces nearby, circuits still sparking feebly. The air smelled of salt and rotting seaweed, but underneath that was something else, an absence of the petroleum and exhaust that always lingered in LA's atmosphere. His smartwatch face was cracked but still functional, showing 11:47 p.m. The date read October 15th, but the year display flickered between 2020 and something impossible, 1716. What the actual... Well, what have we here? Ethan jerked upright to find 3 men standing over him, their silhouettes outlined against the star-drunk sky. Tricorn hats, loose-fitting shirts, and the unmistakable glint of cutlass steel. His brain, still reeling from whatever had happened, tried to process this information and failed spectacularly. "Looks like a survivor from that sloop we spotted breaking up on the reef," said one of them, his voice carrying a strange accent. Part English, part something Caribbean. Fancy clothes, though, silk by the feel of it. Another man, broader and more scarred, spat into the sand near Ethan's feet. Could be Spanish, could be valuable, could be trouble. Only one way to find out. The third man, younger than the others, extended a hand. "On your feet, lad. Captain'll want words with you." Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his phone, but found only empty pocket. He looked around frantically until he spotted it half buried in sand, its cracked screen dark. When he reached for it, the youngest pirate, because these were definitely pirates, his mind finally admitted, grabbed his wrist. "Careful now. What's this curious thing?" The man lifted the phone, turning it over in his hands. "Some manner of spyglass? The craftsmanship is peculiar. It's, Ethan's voice cracked. "It's a navigation device. Very advanced. Very expensive." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You speak strangely, boy. Where are you from?" Before Ethan could concoct an answer, torchlight flickered through the palm trees behind them. More voices, more footsteps. The beach suddenly felt very small and very exposed. "Silas, Tomas, what's the delay?" The voice that cut through the night air belonged to a woman, commanding and sharp. "The tide turns in an hour, and I'll not have the Stormcrow caught in these shallows because you three decided to play with beach refuse." The woman who emerged from the tree line stood barely 5.5 feet tall, but carried herself like she owned every grain of sand beneath her boots. Dark hair was braided with bits of bone and coloured thread, and her coat, a deep blue thing that might once have belonged to a naval officer, hung open to reveal a brace of pistols across her chest. Most striking were her eyes, pale green and sharp enough to cut glass. "Captain Vane," said the youngest pirate, Thomas. "Found this one washed up with wreckage from that Dutch sloop. Claims his bauble here is some sort of navigation aid." Captain Vane's gaze moved from Ethan's face to his clothes, the synthetic fibres of his gaming hoodie, the complex weave of his jeans, the rubber soles of his sneakers. Her expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity. "Navigation, you say?" She plucked the phone from Tomas's grip and examined it more closely. "The glass is remarkably clear. The craftsmanship ... She looked up at Ethan. "What's your name, boy?" "Ethan? Ethan Reyes. Spanish blood, then. But your accent." She circled him slowly, predator-like. "Where did you learn to speak English so cleanly? And where did you acquire clothes of such unusual make?" Ethan's mind raced. He'd read enough fantasy novels to know that claiming to be from the future was a quick path to accusations of madness or sorcery. Neither seemed like good career moves when surrounded by armed pirates. "I'm a scholar," he said carefully, "from a distant university. I was aboard a research vessel studying celestial navigation when the storm hit." "A scholar," Captain Vane's smile was sharp. "How fortunate. The Stormcrow has need of men with learning." She turned to the scarred pirate. "Silas, what think you?" Silas spat again. "I think he's too clean to have been in any shipwreck, and his kit's too fine for any honest scholar. Could be a spy, could be bait. Either way, he's trouble we don't need. Perhaps, or perhaps he's exactly what fate has provided." Vane handed the phone back to Ethan. "Tell me, scholar, can you read the stars?" Ethan glanced up at the alien constellations above them. But they weren't alien, he realised. They were simply the same stars he'd known all his life, viewed from a different latitude and without the light pollution of modern civilization. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, and Polaris glittered like a diamond in the north. "Yes," he said, "I can read them. And can you chart a course by them?" This was dangerous territory. Ethan knew the basics of celestial navigation from astronomy classes and Wikipedia binges, but theory and practice were very different things. Still, it seemed like his best chance of not ending up as shark food. With the proper instruments, yes. Captain Vane studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Ethan Reyes. You'll come aboard the Stormcrow as our navigator, prove useful, and you'll earn your share like any other member of my crew. Prove otherwise." She let the implication hang in the salt air. "What if I refuse? Then Silas gets his wish, and you remain here on this beach. Permanently." Her hand rested casually on the butt of one pistol. "The choice is yours, scholar." Ethan looked around at the empty beach, then at the dense jungle beyond. He had no idea where he was, when he was, or how he'd gotten here. But these people had a ship, which meant they had food, water, and most importantly, mobility. His best chance of figuring out what had happened, and how to get home, lay with them. "I accept." The Stormcrow proved to be a sleek brigantine anchored in a sheltered cove, her twin masts rising like spears against the starfield. As the longboat approached her hull, Ethan could make out carved decorations along her rails and the gleam of bronze cannons in her ports. She was beautiful in the way that all dangerous things were beautiful. Elegant, deadly, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. The next weeks passed in a blur of rope burns, seasickness, and hard-won education in the realities of 18th century piracy. Thomas, despite being only 11 years old, proved an invaluable guide to shipboard life. The boy had grown up on these decks after being orphaned in Port Royal, and his quick wit and street-smart humour made him Ethan's first real friend among the crew. "Keep your head down, speak when spoken to, and never show fear," Thomas whispered, as he taught Ethan to tie proper knots. "Captain Vane's fair but hard. She'll give you every chance to prove yourself, but cross her or show cowardice, and you'll find yourself swimming home." Dr. Adelina Montserrat, the ship's surgeon, presented a different challenge. A woman in her late 20s with intelligent dark eyes and steady hands, she watched Ethan with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Her medical knowledge was impressive for the era, but when Ethan carelessly mentioned the concept of antiseptics during a conversation about treating wounds, her interest became almost predatory. "You speak of invisible creatures that cause infection," she said one evening as she tended to a sailor's infected cut. "This is not theory I have encountered in any medical text. It's a new idea, from the universities in the north." Ethan watched as she cleaned the wound with rum, wincing at the waste of good alcohol. "Have you ever noticed that wounds heal better when cleaned with spirits, rather than water alone?" "I have observed this, yes. But you suggest there is a reason beyond the spirit's heat. What if I told you that bread mould, when properly prepared, could fight infection more effectively than any spirit?" Adelina's eyebrows rose. "I would say you're either a genius or a madman, possibly both." It was during their third week at sea that Ethan's modern knowledge proved its worth in dramatic fashion. He was on night watch, using his smartwatch's digital compass and star chart app, carefully hidden from view to verify their position, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The constellation of Cassiopeia hung too low on the horizon. Combined with the Southern Cross's position, it meant they were sailing directly toward a reef system that wasn't marked on any of their charts. "Captain!" Ethan's shout brought Vane running from her cabin, half-dressed and fully armed. "Hard to starboard! There's a reef directly ahead!" "I see no reef," Silas growled from the helm. "The water's deep here, boy. Check your instruments." "Trust me." Ethan pointed at the subtle change in wave patterns barely visible in the moonlight. "The waves are breaking differently. There's something large and shallow about 200 yards ahead." Captain Vane studied the water for a heartbeat, then bellowed, "All hands! Hard to starboard! Drop anchor when I give the word." The Stormcrow heeled over as her crew threw their weight into the turn. 30 seconds later, the lookout's cry confirmed Ethan's warning. "Reef to port." Damn near took her belly out. That night, as the crew celebrated their narrow escape with an extra ration of rum, Captain Vane approached Ethan at the bow rail. "Your eyes are sharper than any man's I've known," she said quietly, "and your knowledge of star paths runs deeper than most. Tell me true, what are you running from, Ethan Reyes?" "Why do you assume I'm running from something?" "Because men don't join pirate crews out of wanderlust. They join because the life they left behind offers them nothing, or because staying would mean death." Her pale eyes reflected starlight. "Which is it for you?" Ethan considered telling her the truth, the whole impossible truth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I'm looking for something. Something I lost." "What manner of thing?" "The way home." Vane nodded slowly. "Aye, that's something we're all seeking one way or another." She turned to go, then paused. "The crew respects you now. You've earned that. Don't squander it." Their first raid came 2 days later, when they intercepted a Dutch merchant vessel heavy with sugar and silver from the Caribbean colonies. Ethan had hoped to avoid the violence, to somehow remain a non-combatant, but Captain Vane made it clear that every member of her crew fought when fighting was required. "A ship is only as strong as her weakest link," she told him, as the crew prepared for battle. "If you won't fight beside us, you're not one of us. And if you're not one of us..." The boarding action was brief and brutal. Ethan found himself swept along by the tide of screaming pirates, cutlass in hand, too terrified to do anything but swing when someone swung at him. The Dutch crew surrendered quickly, but not before Ethan had seen men die, really die, with blood and screams and the terrible finality of stopped hearts. In the aftermath, as the crew divided the spoils, Ethan made a discovery that changed everything. In the merchant captain's cabin, hidden beneath a false bottom in a chest of navigation instruments, he found half of something that made his smartwatch's sensors go haywire. It was jade, carved in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. Metallic veins ran through the stone. Magnetite, he realised, remembering his physics classes. When he held it close to his watch, the device's magnetic field sensors spiked, and for just a moment, the cracked screen flickered with readings that defied logic. Temporal displacement detected scrolled across the display before it went dark again. Quantum signature match 94%. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This thing, whatever it was connected to what had happened to him. Connected to the aurora, to the impossible rift that had torn him from 2020 and dumped him in 1716. Ah, you've found my little treasure. Ethan spun to find Captain Vane watching from the cabin doorway, her expression unreadable. This is yours? Now it is. Took it from a Spanish treasure ship 3 months past, along with the other half. She produced a matching piece of jade from beneath her coat. The Spanish captain said it was an Aztec artifact, combined with Chinese astronomical knowledge, called it the Jade Astrolabe. When the two halves were brought together, they formed a perfect sphere covered in intricate carvings, symbols that looked like star maps mixed with mathematical formulas, and threading through it all were those metallic veins that made Ethan's watch go berserk. There was writing with it, Vane continued, a prophecy of sorts. When the starborn child comes to mend the sky at Dragon Gate, twin suns shall writhe and heaven's door shall open. Poetic nonsense, I thought. But now... She looked at Ethan meaningfully. Now I wonder... Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion on deck. Silas burst into the cabin, his scarred face twisted with anger. "Captain, we have a problem. That merchant vessel we took, she was flying Dutch colours, but her papers mark her as English. We've just robbed a ship under Crown protection." Vane's jaw tightened. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough. And certain that Commodore Nathaniel Hawke of His Majesty's Navy will be hunting us within the week. He's been stalking these waters for months, looking for any excuse to put a noose around your neck." The name seemed to hit Captain Vane like a physical blow. Her hand went instinctively to a scar along her collarbone, and her eyes hardened. "Hawke," she whispered, "then we run. Set course for Tortuga. We need information, supplies, and a place to lay low while we plan our next move." Tortuga proved to be everything Ethan had imagined and worse. The infamous pirate haven was a sprawling collection of ramshackle buildings, taverns that never closed, and people who asked no questions as long as your silver was good. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, cheap rum and moral decay. It was there, in a tavern called the Laughing Skull, that they met the cartographer who would change everything. He was an ancient man, skin like leather and eyes clouded with cataracts, but his hands were steady as he examined the jade astrolabe by flickering candlelight. "I know this device," he wheezed. "Seen its like once before in the hands of a Chinese explorer who claimed it could open doors between the world of the living and the realm of spirits." He traced the carved symbols with one gnarled finger. "But this one's different, more complex. The star patterns..." He looked up sharply at Ethan. "You understand astronomy, young man?" "Some." "Then you'll know these aren't random decorations. They're a star map, showing the positions of celestial bodies during events of great magnetic disturbance. Solar storms, they call them in the Chinese texts, when the sun's fire reaches out to touch the earth." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And Dragon Gate?" The old man's smile was gap-toothed and knowing. "A place where the earth's magnetic field runs strange, where compasses spin like dancers and the northern lights sometimes touch the water. The Spanish call it El Triángulo del Diablo. Your people might know it by another name." The Bermuda Triangle. Ethan's blood turned to ice water. He was talking about the Bermuda Triangle, that legendary region where ships and planes disappeared without trace. And if the prophecy was right, if the astrolabe could somehow open heaven's door during a solar storm... "How far to Dragon Gate?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 3 days hard sailing to the northeast, but you'll not want to go there, lad. Ships that enter those waters during the aurora storms, they don't come back." That night, as the crew slept off their shore leave, Ethan found Captain Vane standing at the Stormcrow's bow rail, staring out at the star-drunk Caribbean sky. "You're planning to sail for Dragon Gate," he said. It wasn't a question. "Aye. The prophecy speaks of a starborn child who will mend the sky. You arrive from nowhere, speaking strangely, dressed in clothes no tailor on earth has made, carrying devices that confound our understanding." She turned to face him. "Tell me true, Ethan Reyes. Are you that child?" Ethan looked into her pale green eyes and made a decision that would doom them all. "Yes," he said. "I am." The next morning brought news that chilled everyone's blood. Thomas had gone ashore the previous evening and failed to return. Search parties found him in the custody of local authorities, arrested for brawling with British sailors. But the circumstances were suspicious. Witnesses claimed the British had started the fight and that Thomas had been targeted specifically. "It's a trap," Silas growled as they gathered in Vane's cabin to plan a rescue. "Hawke's here, or his agents are. They're using the boy as bait." "Then we give them what they expect," Vane replied. "We walk into their trap, but we do it on our terms." The rescue mission that followed became the stuff of legend among the Tortuga taverns. Ethan, driven by guilt and desperate to save his young friend, proposed a plan that seemed insane but just might work. Using his knowledge of chemistry and the ship's store of gunpowder, he improvised a series of flashbang explosives that would disorient their enemies long enough for a swift extraction. The plan worked perfectly until it didn't. They freed Thomas and were fighting their way back to the harbour when British Marines appeared from concealment, cutting off their escape route. In the running battle that followed, Ethan found himself fighting alongside Captain Vane, his modern reflexes and unpredictable tactics proving surprisingly effective against trained military opponents. It was during that fight that he saw her true nature for the first time. Arabella Vane wasn't just a pirate captain, she was a force of nature, moving through combat with lethal grace, every shot perfectly placed, every sword stroke economical and deadly. But there was something else in her eyes as she fought, something that looked almost like joy. They made it back to the Stormcrow and escaped into open water, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of their pursuer. Commodore Nathaniel Hawke stood on the dock watching their departure, and even at a distance Ethan could see the cold intelligence in the man's pale eyes. This was no ordinary naval officer. This was a hunter who had found his prey. "He'll follow us," Vane said as Tortuga fell behind them. "Hawke's lost too much to pirates to let us slip away again. He'll dog our wake until one of us is dead." "What did you take from him?" Ethan asked. Vane's hand went to her collarbone scar again. His brother, 3 years ago, off the coast of Jamaica. Young Lieutenant Hawke, fresh from England and full of righteous fire. He died with a sword in his hand and my blade in his heart. That night, as they sailed toward the mysterious waters of Dragon Gate, Ethan told Captain Vane the truth. All of it. The time travel, the quantum rift, his desperate need to return to 2020. He expected disbelief, mockery, perhaps accusations of madness. Instead, she listened in thoughtful silence, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated a sharp understanding of both navigation and natural philosophy. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The aurora that night you arrived," she said finally. "I've sailed these waters for 10 years, and I've never seen lights like that so far south. And your devices, your knowledge of star paths we've never charted." She nodded slowly. I believe you. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. We use the astrolabe. We wait for another solar storm and we open the rift. And then I go home." Ethan met her eyes. "And you become legend." The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere of anticipation and dread. The crew sensed that something momentous was approaching, but only a handful knew the full truth. Dr. Montserrat had been brought into their confidence, and her scientific mind had seized on the implications with fierce enthusiasm. "If what you describe is true," she told Ethan, as they prepared the astrolabe, "then we are about to witness the greatest natural phenomenon in human history. The practical applications alone." Her eyes shone with possibilities. The medical knowledge you've shared, the concept of bacterial infection, the potential of bread mould as an antiseptic. This could save thousands of lives. "We'll save thousands of lives," Ethan corrected, "in about 300 years. They reached Dragon Gate on the morning of the 3rd day, sailing into waters that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Compasses began spinning wildly, and several crew members reported feeling strange tingles in their extremities. Ethan's smartwatch, which had been mostly dormant since his arrival, suddenly blazed to life with readings that defied explanation. "Magnetic anomaly detected," scrolled across its cracked screen. "Temporal field fluctuation imminent. Quantum cascade event probable." "How long?" Captain Vane asked, reading over his shoulder. "Soon. The solar storm's building. Look at the horizon." To the north, the sky was beginning to take on an unnatural hue, green and violet threads dancing between the clouds. Aurora Borealis, impossibly far south, painting the Caribbean sky with colours that belonged to the Arctic. It was then that Commodore Hawke's frigate appeared on the southern horizon, her white sails cutting through the afternoon heat like knife blades. But she wasn't alone. Another ship sailed alongside her, flying familiar colours. "Christ's blood," Silas breathed. "That's the Storm Crow." He was right. Impossibly, there were now two Storm Crows sailing these waters, the one they stood on and another approaching from the south under the guns of Hawke's frigate. "Temporal echo," Ethan whispered. "The rift's already beginning to form. We're seeing ourselves from another timeline, another possibility." But even as he spoke, he realised the truth was worse than that. The second Storm Crow flew different colours, not the black flag of piracy, but the red banner of mutiny. Silas had finally made his move, seizing control of the ship and delivering it to Hawke in exchange for a royal pardon. "All hands, prepare for battle!" Vane's voice carried across the deck like a clarion call. "Mr. Crow has shown his true colours at last, but will not go gentle into that good night." The battle that followed defied every convention of naval warfare. 3 ships manoeuvred through waters that seemed to twist space itself, while overhead the aurora grew stronger, casting eerie light across the scene. Ethan climbed the mainmast with the jade astrolabe, trying to align its intricate mechanisms with the growing magnetic storm above. Cannon fire thundered across the water as the two Storm Crows engaged each other in a battle that was both real and impossible. Ethan could see Silas on the deck of the other ship, bellowing orders to crew members who should have been standing right beside him. The paradox was tearing reality apart at the seams. "Now, Ethan," Captain Vane's voice cut through the chaos. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Above them, the Aurora had become a writhing mass of energy that seemed to reach down toward the sea. Lightning crackled between the masts of all 3 ships, and the water itself began to glow with phosphorescent fire. Ethan pressed the 2 halves of the astrolabe together and felt power surge through the device like a living thing. The jade sphere began to spin in his hands, its carved symbols blazing with inner light. The metallic veins that ran through it sparked and danced, and suddenly the air around him tore open like fabric. Through the rift, Ethan could see Griffith Park in 2020. His own world, his own time, calling to him across centuries. The portal pulsed with every heartbeat, and he knew that if he was going to go, it had to be now. But as he prepared to leap through, he looked down at the deck of the Storm Crow and saw his friends fighting for their lives. Thomas, barely 11 years old, standing back to back with Dr. Montserrat as they faced Hawke's Marines. Captain Vane, blood streaming from a wound on her forehead, still fighting with the fury of a hurricane given human form. He could save himself. He could go home. All he had to do was jump. Instead, Ethan Reyes made the decision that would echo through legend for centuries to come. He twisted the astrolabe's mechanisms, not to stabilise the portal, but to redirect its energy. The rift that had opened to 2020 collapsed, but in its place, new doorways tore open across the battlefield. Commodore Hawke's frigate, caught in the dimensional crossfire, vanished into a swirling vortex that deposited it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, circa 1543. The mutinous Storm Crow, along with Silas and his treacherous crew, fell through a rift that led to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, but in the year 2157. The energy backlash sent Ethan tumbling from the mast into the churning waters below. As he fell, he felt Captain Vane's ring, a simple band of gold set with a single emerald, pressed into his palm. "Remember us," her voice followed him into the dark water. "Remember that we were here." The last thing Ethan saw before the portal collapsed was Arabella Vane standing at the rail of the Storm Crow, her pale green eyes bright with tears and laughter, watching him disappear into the space between moments. He woke up in Griffith Park, lying in a crater of scorched earth, with his ruined VR headset still smoking beside him. The aurora was fading from the sky, and his phone, miraculously intact, showed 11:48 p.m, October 15th, 2020. Only 1 minute had passed since the accident, but in his hand he held Captain Vane's ring, and embedded in the VR headset circuitry was a fragment of jade that pulsed with inner light. Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into research with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove he wasn't insane. He studied astrophysics, quantum mechanics and temporal theory, looking for any scientific explanation for what had happened to him. The jade fragment resisted all attempts at analysis, but his smartwatch had recorded enough data to suggest that his impossible journey had actually occurred. The final proof came 2 months later, when he was visiting the Natural History Museum downtown. In a new exhibit on colonial Caribbean artifacts, he found a display case containing a gold ring set with an emerald dated to approximately 1720. The placard read, "Ring of unknown origin, discovered in the personal effects of the notorious pirate captain known as Grim, Arabella Vane." According to contemporary accounts, Captain Vane claimed the ring was a gift from a starborn navigator who saved her crew from destruction. Historians consider this claim to be typical pirate folklore, though the ring's provenance remains mysterious. Ethan stared at the display for a long time, remembering pale green eyes and the sound of his name called across 3 centuries. Then he walked out of the museum and into his future, carrying the weight of legend and the knowledge that somewhere in the past his friends were still sailing toward their destiny. In his apartment that night, as he worked on new equations that might someday allow him to control temporal rifts instead of simply stumbling through them, Ethan Reyes smiled and thought he heard the distant sound of wind in rigging and waves against a ship's hull. Somewhere in 1720, Captain Arabella Vane stood at the bow of the Stormcrow and watched the aurora dance across the Caribbean sky, remembering a strange young man who had taught her crew that legends were just truth waiting to be discovered. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The bronze shield gleamed under the museum's harsh fluorescent lights, its surface pitted with age and battle scars. 17-year-old Marcus Chen pressed closer to the display case, ignoring his classmates' chatter about the field trip ending soon. The placard read Spartan Hoplon Shield, 5th century BCE, on loan from the Athens Archaeological Museum. But what drew Marcus wasn't the historical significance. It was the crack running through the bronze, revealing something that glowed faintly beneath. "Hey Chen, stop drooling over rusty metal and come on," called Jake from across the ancient Greece exhibit. "Bus leaves in 5 minutes." Marcus waved him off, transfixed by the serpentine design etched around the shield's rim. The snake appeared to be eating its own tail, the metalwork so intricate it seemed almost alive in the shifting light. Without thinking, he reached out and touched the glass barrier. The security rope had somehow fallen away, leaving the case partially open. His fingertips brushed the crack in the bronze. The world exploded into blinding white light. Pain lanced through his skull as consciousness returned. Marcus groaned, tasting dust and something metallic. Blood. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when he opened his eyes, the sterile museum lighting was gone. Instead, harsh Mediterranean sunlight beat down on him from a cloudless sky. "Get up, you worthless dog!" The words were shouted in a language Marcus somehow understood, though he'd never heard it before. A shadow fell across him as someone grabbed his arm and yanked him upright. Marcus found himself staring into the weathered face of a man whose dark eyes held no warmth. The stranger wore a bronze breastplate over a crimson cloak, a short sword at his hip. "I said, get up!" The man's grip tightened painfully. "You think you can run from the Agoj? Think you can hide in the dust like a coward?" Marcus stumbled to his feet, his modern sneakers slipping on the packed earth. Around him, the air rang with the sounds of combat training, wooden spears clacking together, grunts of effort, and the harsh commands of instructors. Dozens of young men, none older than 20, practiced formations in the scorching heat. Their bronzed bodies gleamed with sweat as they moved with deadly precision. Where am I?" Marcus stammered. The instructor's eyes narrowed. "Playing foolish games, are we?" His hand moved to his sword hilt. "You're in the Agog, boy, training ground of Spartan warriors, and if you don't start acting like one, you'll feed the crows before sunset." Spartan? The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't possible. He'd been in the museum touching the shield, and now... He looked down at himself, noting his jeans and t-shirt looked utterly foreign among the leather and bronze surrounding him. His smartphone was gone, as was his backpack. Only the clothes on his back remained from his real life. "You dress strangely for a Spartan youth," the instructor said, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Where are you from, boy?" Marcus's mind raced. How could he possibly explain? "I'm not from around here." "Clearly." The man studied him with calculating eyes. "You'll train with the others. Keep up or die." Those are your choices." He shoved Marcus toward a group of teenagers engaged in weapons practice. "And lose those ridiculous shoes. Spartans train barefoot." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and confusion. Marcus was thrust into sword drills he'd never learned, forced to run across terrain that tore his feet bloody, and pummeled by opponents who'd been training since childhood. Every mistake earned him a blow from the instructor's staffs. Every sign of weakness brought mockery from the other trainees. "Look at him stumble like a newborn calf," sneered a broad-shouldered boy with cold blue eyes. "Are we training warriors or wet nurses?" "Enough, Alexios," said another voice. Marcus turned to see a lean youth with intelligent dark eyes stepping between them. "He's learning. We all had to start somewhere." "You defend weakness, Nicomedes?" Alexios spat. "In Sparta the weak serve only one purpose, to die so the strong may live." Nicomedes didn't flinch. "And the wise know when to speak and when to train." "Which are you doing?" For a moment Marcus thought Alexios might attack his defender. Instead, the blonde boy smiled coldly and turned back to his drills. But Marcus caught the promise of violence in his eyes. That first night, as the other boys settled on their rough straw pallets, Nicomedes approached Marcus's corner of the sleeping quarters. The older boy moved quietly, careful not to wake the others. "You're not Spartan," he said simply. "Your accent is wrong, your movements untrained. Where do you really come from?" Marcus weighed his options. The truth was impossible to believe, but lies would only complicate things further. "Somewhere far away," he said finally, "very far away." Nicomedes nodded thoughtfully. "Your strange knowledge today, the way you tied knots, how you cleaned that wound on Demonikos' arm. Where did you learn such things?" During the training, Marcus had instinctively used techniques he'd learned in Boy Scouts and first aid class. The Spartan methods were crude by comparison, and he'd helped where he could. "My teachers, they showed me different ways." "Different indeed." Nicomedes settled beside him, keeping his voice low. "You spoke of pressure points when stopping bleeding, mentioned something called infection. These are not words I know, yet they seem wise." Marcus felt a spark of hope. If he could find even one ally in this brutal place, perhaps he had a chance of survival. "I can share what I know, if you'll help me understand your ways. A fair trade." Nicomedes extended his hand in the Spartan manner, gripping Marcus's forearm. "But know this. The instructors will show you no mercy for being foreign. Here, you either prove yourself or you die. There is no third option." The words proved prophetic. The following days brought increasing brutality as the instructors tested Marcus's limits. Dawn runs across mountain paths left his feet shredded and bleeding. Wrestling matches left him bruised and battered. Weapons training with wooden swords resulted in cracked ribs and split lips. Yet slowly, impossibly, he began to adapt. His modern understanding of anatomy helped him avoid serious injury. His knowledge of leverage and physics improved his fighting technique, and most importantly, his alliance with Nicomedes provided crucial insights into Spartan culture and expectations. "They're not just testing your strength," Nicomedes explained as they shared meagre rations of black broth and barley bread. "They're testing your spirit. Can you endure suffering without complaint? Will you protect your fellow Spartans even at cost to yourself? Do you have the will to kill when killing is necessary?" That last question haunted Marcus. In his world, violence was something you saw in movies or video games. Here, it was the foundation of existence. Every day brought training in how to efficiently end human life, and every night he wondered what kind of person he was becoming. The breaking point came during their third week, when the instructors announced a survival exercise. Each trainee would be sent into the Laconian wilderness with nothing but a bronze dagger and the clothes on their back. They were to survive for 7 days, hunting their own food and finding their own shelter. "This is your first taste of the Crypteia," announced the chief instructor, a scarred veteran named Cleomenes. "The secret war that every Spartan must learn to fight. You will be alone, cold and hungry. The weak will not return. The strong will forge themselves in hardship's fire." As they prepared to depart, Alexios cornered Marcus near the armory. "I know what you are," he hissed. "Some foreign spy, maybe a Persian agent sent to weaken us from within. But you won't survive the wilderness. I'll make sure of it." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'm not your enemy, Alexios." "All outsiders are enemies." The blonde boy's hand rested on his dagger hilt. "Sparta for Spartans. The weak and foreign have no place among us." The wilderness of Laconia stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of rocky hills, dense forests, and hidden ravines that could shelter wild beasts or enemy raiders. Marcus found himself alone for the first time since arriving in this ancient world, with nothing but his wits and hard-earned training to keep him alive. The first day brought the harsh lesson of hunger. His modern sensibilities recoiled from the idea of killing animals for food, but his growling stomach soon overcame such squeamishness. Using techniques he'd learned in outdoor survival courses, he fashioned snares from plant fibres and caught small game. The meat was tough and gamey, but it kept him alive. By the third day he'd found a defensible cave near a stream and established a routine of hunting, gathering and maintaining his shelter. His feet had toughened from weeks of barefoot training, and his hands no longer blistered from handling rough tools and weapons. Perhaps most importantly, his mind had adapted to the constant alertness required for survival. That night, as he roasted a rabbit over his small fire, Marcus heard the snap of a twig outside his cave. He froze, every sense straining. Then Alexios stepped into the firelight, bronze dagger gleaming in his hand. "Did you think I wouldn't follow you?" the Spartan boy said. "Did you think I'd let you return and corrupt our ranks with your foreign weakness?" Marcus rose slowly, his own dagger appearing in his hand. "This doesn't have to happen, Alexios. We're both Spartans now." "You will never be Spartan!" Alexios lunged forward, his blade seeking Marcus's throat. The fight that followed was nothing like the controlled training matches in the Agoge. This was desperate, brutal, and potentially fatal. Alexios fought with skill honed by years of training, but Marcus had advantages the Spartan boy didn't expect. His modern understanding of anatomy let him target vulnerable spots. His knowledge of physics helped him use leverage against his stronger opponent. They grappled in the dirt outside the cave, each seeking to drive his blade home. Alexios was stronger, but Marcus was more desperate. When the blonde boy tried to pin him down, Marcus used a wrestling move he'd learned in high school, rolling his opponent and reversing their positions. For a moment, Marcus held the advantage. Alexios lay beneath him, dagger knocked away, throat exposed. One thrust would end the fight forever. The Spartan way demanded it. Kill or be killed. Show no mercy to enemies. But as Marcus raised his blade, he saw something in Alexios's eyes that stopped him cold. Not just fear, but desperate need. This boy had been raised from birth to believe that only the strong deserved to live, that showing mercy was tantamount to treason against Spartan values. He expected to die because Marcus had proven stronger. "I'm not going to kill you," Marcus said quietly. Alexios stared at him in shock. "What?" "We're both Spartans. We both serve the same purpose." Marcus stood and offered his hand. "The real enemy isn't each other. It's the wilderness, the cold, the hunger. Fight those, not me." For a long moment Alexios remained on the ground, staring at the extended hand. Then, slowly, he reached up and grasped it. Marcus pulled him to his feet, and they stood facing each other in the flickering firelight. "I don't understand you," Alexios said finally. "Neither do I, sometimes." Marcus gestured to his fire and the roasted meat. "But I understand hunger. Share my fire tonight. Tomorrow we can go back to being rivals." They sat in awkward silence, sharing the meal and warmth. As the fire burned low, Alexios finally spoke again. "Where are you really from? And don't say, far away. I want the truth." Marcus stared into the dying flames, weighing his words carefully. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. I'm from another time, a time far in the future, where men have forgotten how to be warriors, where battles are fought with weapons you can't imagine, and people live in cities larger than all of Sparta." Alexios was quiet for a long time. "That's impossible." "I know it is, but it's true. How did you come here?" Marcus told him about the museum, the bronze shield, the strange glow he'd seen in the crack. As he spoke, he remembered something that made his pulse quicken, the serpent symbol etched around the shield's rim, eating its own tail. "I've seen that symbol," Alexios said when Marcus described it. "In the old caves, where our ancestors made offerings to the gods. There are carvings there, ancient even by Spartan standards." "Where?" Marcus's heart raced. "Where are these caves?" "Half a day's journey north, But they're forbidden. Cursed, some say. Why do you want to know? Because that symbol might be my way home. They set out at first light, travelling through terrain that grew increasingly wild and treacherous. The caves Alexios spoke of lay hidden in a narrow ravine, their entrances almost invisible among the rocky cliffs. Ancient stone markers warned away the curious, carved with symbols that predated even the early Spartan settlements. Inside the largest cave, Marcus found what he was looking for. The walls were covered with primitive paintings and carvings, some depicting scenes of hunting and warfare. But at the very back, in a natural alcove that felt heavy with age and power, he found the serpent. The symbol was identical to the one on the bronze shield, a snake consuming its own tail, carved into the living rock with painstaking detail. But more importantly, beneath the carving sat something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It looked like an hourglass, but made of materials he couldn't identify. The frame appeared to be some kind of crystal or precious stone, while the sand inside glowed with a faint pulsing light. The same light he'd seen in the crack of the museum shield. "What is that thing?" Alexios whispered. Marcus reached for the artifact with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched its surface, energy coursed up his arms. The cave around him seemed to shimmer and blur, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. "It's my way home," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus found himself hesitating. Home meant returning to his comfortable life of school and video games and fast food. It meant leaving behind the harsh but purposeful world he'd begun to understand. It meant abandoning Nicomedes, and yes, even Alexios, who had become something more than enemies in the wilderness. "You would leave us?" Alexios asked, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, the blonde boy's voice held no mockery or cruelty. "Leave Sparta? I don't belong here," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. "I'm not really a Spartan. Aren't you?" Alexios gestured to Marcus's scarred hands, his sun-darkened skin, the lean muscle he'd built through weeks of brutal training. "You've endured the same trials we have, bled the same blood, shared the same struggles." It was true. The soft teenager who'd touched a museum display case felt like a different person entirely. This Marcus had learned to fight, to survive, to push beyond limits he'd never imagined. He'd found strength he didn't know he possessed, and forged bonds deeper than any friendship from his old life. But he'd also seen the darkness of this world, the casual acceptance of violence, the rigid hierarchy that crushed individual thought, the expectation that weakness deserved death. How much of himself was he willing to sacrifice to belong here? A distant horn echoed through the ravine, interrupting his thoughts, the signal for the end of the survival trial. They had to return. "Come on," Alexios said. "Whatever you decide, we need to get back before they send search parties." They emerged from the caves to find the other survivors already gathering at the designated meeting point. Of the 30 who had entered the wilderness, only 23 remained. Some had fallen to wild animals, others to exposure or starvation. The instructors showed no emotion at the losses. This was simply the way of things. "So the foreigners' lives," sneered one of the survivors, a brutish boy named Pantetes. "I'm surprised the wolves didn't finish him off." "He fought well," Alexios said simply, and the unexpected defence silenced Pantetes. If Alexios, who had openly despised Marcus, now spoke for him, others would listen. Nicomedes appeared at Marcus's shoulder, relief evident in his dark eyes. "I worried you might not return. The mountains are dangerous, especially for those unused to them." "I had help," Marcus said, glancing at Alexios, "and I learned things about myself I didn't know." The march back to the Agog took most of the day. As they crested the final hill overlooking the training grounds, Marcus felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been homecoming. The harsh landscape, the shouting instructors, the smell of sweat and bronze. It had all become familiar, even comforting in its brutal predictability. But their trials weren't over. Chief Instructor Cleomenes waited for them in the main courtyard, flanked by several senior warriors whose scarred faces spoke of decades of warfare. 23 return, he announced. 7 proved themselves unworthy of Spartan blood, but for the rest of you, one final test remains. He gestured, and weapon racks were brought forward. Not the wooden training swords they'd grown accustomed to, but real bronze blades honed to razor sharpness. "You will fight," Cleomenes continued, "not to practice, not to learn, but to prove. Each of you will face an opponent chosen by the instructors. Victory brings graduation to full warrior status. Defeat. He shrugged. The wounded may recover and try again next season. The dead will feed the carrion birds. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. They were expected to fight to the death? But looking around at his fellow trainees, he saw only acceptance on their faces. This was the Spartan way. Only the strong survived to take their place in the ranks of the warriors. Marcus of the Strange Lands, Cleomenes called, you will face Alexios, son of Lysander. A murmur ran through the assembled trainees. Everyone knew of their rivalry, their confrontation in the wilderness. This would be a popular match among the spectators already gathering at the edge of the combat circle. As they took their positions, bronze swords glinting in the afternoon sun, Marcus found himself thinking of the artifact hidden in his belt pouch. He'd managed to conceal it during the march back, and its weight seemed to pulse against his hip. One touch, one moment of concentration, and he could escape this world forever. But that would mean abandoning his friend Nicomedes, leaving Alexios, who had grown from enemy to grudging ally, fleeing from a life that had forged him into someone stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. "Begin!" Cleomenes shouted. Alexios came forward cautiously, his blade held in perfect form. Around them the crowd grew silent, straining to see every detail of what many expected to be a fight to the death. "I won't kill you," Marcus said quietly as they circled each other. "And I won't kill you," Alexios replied. "But we must make them believe we might." They began to duel, bronze ringing against bronze in a deadly dance. Both had learned much in their weeks of training, and both fought with skill that impressed the watching instructors. Marcus used his knowledge of anatomy and physics to find openings, while Alexios countered with perfect Spartan technique and years of experience. Back and forth they went, neither gaining decisive advantage. Cuts appeared on arms and legs, blood stained the packed earth, but somehow both fighters managed to avoid fatal wounds. The crowd grew restless. They wanted to see death, not an extended dance. "Finish it," someone shouted. "One of you must fall." That's when Marcus saw his opportunity. As Alexios pressed forward with a particularly aggressive attack, Marcus sidestepped and grabbed his opponent's sword arm. To the watching crowd, it would look like he was setting up for a killing blow. Instead, he whispered urgently in Alexios' ear. "Trust me," he said, then swept the blonde boy's legs and sent him crashing to the ground. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent, bronze sword raised high. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the death blow. Instead, Marcus planted his blade point first in the earth and offered his hand to help Alexios up. "Spartans don't kill Spartans," he declared loudly enough for all to hear. "We are brothers in war, united against all enemies. This man fought well and honourably. He deserves respect, not death." For a moment, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Chief Instructor Cleomenes stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. "Interesting philosophy," he said. "And where did you learn this wisdom, young Marcus?" "From a teacher far away," Marcus replied. "One who understood that strength shared is strength multiplied." Cleomenes studied him for a long moment, then looked at Alexios, who had accepted Marcus's help and now stood beside him. "And you agree with this foreign wisdom, son of Lysander?" Alexios straightened his shoulders. "Marcus has proven himself in training, in the wilderness, and now in combat. If having him as an ally makes Sparta stronger, then I call him brother." The older warrior nodded slowly. "Then you have both passed your trials. Not because you know how to kill, any fool with a sharp stick can kill, but because you know when not to kill, and that is wisdom few warriors ever achieve." The crowd erupted in surprised cheers. It was an unprecedented decision, but Cleomenes was a respected veteran whose judgment carried great weight. Other pairs of fighters, inspired by what they'd witnessed, began finding ways to end their duels without fatalities. Not all succeeded. The brutal realities of Spartan training still claimed 2 lives that day, but the precedent had been set. As the sun set over the training grounds, Marcus found himself officially recognized as a Spartan warrior. He bore the scars, had endured the trials and earned the respect of his peers. For all practical purposes, he belonged here now. That night, as he sat with Nicomedes and Alexios around a small fire, sharing wine and stories of their trials, Marcus felt the weight of the artifact in his pouch. It still glowed faintly. still pulsed with the energy that could return him to his own time. But for the first time since arriving in this ancient world, he wasn't sure he wanted to use it. "What are you thinking about?" Nicomedes asked, noting his distant expression. "Home," Marcus said simply, "and whether it's a place you come from or a place you choose to be." "Deep thoughts for a warrior fresh from his trials," Alexios said with a grin that held none of his former cruelty. "Save such philosophy for the old men who have nothing better to do than contemplate their navels." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "Or maybe that's exactly when such thoughts matter most, when you're young enough to act on them." He reached into his pouch and withdrew the ancient artifact, letting its glow illuminate their small circle. His companions stared at it in wonder, neither having seen its like before. "What is it?" Nicomedes breathed. "My way home," Marcus said. "My ticket back to the world I came from." For a moment they sat in silence, watching the strange light pulse and dance. Then Alexios spoke, his voice unusually serious. "Whatever world you came from, it made you strong enough to survive here. Strong enough to change how we see things. Maybe that was the point." Marcus looked at his friends, for that's what they had become, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. In his own time, he'd had acquaintances, people he hung out with at school or texted occasionally, but never anything like the bonds he'd formed here, tempered by real danger and genuine trust. Yet he also thought of his parents, who would be wondering where he'd disappeared to. His little sister, who despite her bratty tendencies, he genuinely missed. The comfortable life of hot showers, warm beds, and unlimited food that awaited him if he chose to return. "Decisions are easier when you have no choice," he said finally. "Then make a choice that gives you more choices later," Nicomedes suggested. "The artifact will still work tomorrow, won't it? Or next week?" Marcus nodded. The device showed no signs of instability or decay. If anything, it seemed to pulse more strongly now that he'd found it, as if responding to his proximity. "Then stay a while longer," Alexios said. "Learn what it truly means to be Spartan. See if this world can become home, or if your other world calls too strongly to ignore." It was reasonable advice, and Marcus found himself nodding. "One more season," he decided. "Let me see what kind of warrior I can become, what kind of man I can be here. Then I'll choose." The artifact's glow seemed to pulse in approval as he tucked it away. Around them, the sounds of the agog settled into evening quiet, the distant conversations of guards on duty, the rustle of wind through the training grounds, the soft snores of exhausted young warriors getting their rest. Marcus lay back on his rough pallet, staring up at stars that looked exactly the same as they had in his own time. Some things, he reflected, were truly eternal. The struggle to find one's place in the world, the bonds forged through shared adversity, the choice between comfort and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new training, and eventually new battles. The Spartans were always at war with someone, Athenians, Persians, or rebellious helots. He would face real combat, real danger, and discover what kind of warrior he truly was. But tonight, for the first time since touching that bronze shield in a museum that wouldn't exist for thousands of years, Marcus Chen felt at peace. He had found strength he didn't know he possessed, friends who had become brothers, and a purpose greater than anything his old life had offered. The choice between worlds would come again, he knew. But for now, he was content to be exactly where he was, a young Spartan warrior, scarred by trials and strengthened by adversity, carrying the wisdom of both past and future in his heart. As sleep claimed him, Marcus's hand unconsciously moved to the artifact hidden beneath his pillow. It pulsed once, gently, as if acknowledging his decision. Then its glow faded to a barely perceptible ember, waiting patiently for the moment when its power would be needed again. In the distance, a wolf howled across the Laconian hills, and Marcus smiled in his sleep. He was no longer afraid of wolves, or darkness, or the brutal uncertainties of ancient life. He had become something new, not quite the modern teenager he'd been, not quite the ancient warrior his training had shaped him into, but a bridge between worlds, carrying the best of both into whatever future awaited. The bronze shield in that distant museum had cracked for a reason, he thought, drowsily. Some barriers were meant to be broken, some journeys were meant to be taken, and sometimes finding yourself required losing everything you thought you knew about who you were supposed to be. Marcus Chen had come to ancient Sparta by accident, but he would stay by choice, at least for now. The future, both past and present, could wait for one more season while a young warrior learned exactly what he was capable of becoming. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.